Four men in gray robes are standing on the pier in the freezing rain. One is crying. The second is cursing. The third is simply silent. And the fourth, the former vice president of Korea's largest conglomerate, is looking at the prison in front of him and, for some reason, counting the guards. 16. All four are armed with automatic rifles, and his mind won't shut off. His name is Cho Dae-Hyun, cell B447, 26 years old. Just yesterday, he was signing documents in his office on the 42nd floor overlooking Seoul. Now he's wearing a prison jumpsuit that smells of bleach and someone else's sweat. He's counting. 4 watchtowers, 3 searchlights, 2 rows of barbed wire, 120 meters to the gate. He doesn't know why. His brain pressed the button on its own and launched a program that won't shut down. This is Blackstone Isle, an island prison in neutral waters. Officially, it doesn't appear on any map. Unofficially, 2,500 people are rotting here. People who can't be killed but must be erased. Witnesses, heirs who are a hindrance, former spies, people with dangerous knowledge. And now, among them, is the heir to a $57 billion empire. A guard jabs him in the back with the butt of his rifle. Dae-Hyun strides forward across the wet concrete. The rain hasn't completely washed away the dark stains beneath his feet. Someone spilled blood here quite recently, and they simply didn't bother to wipe it up. He walks across these stains and thinks of a single number: 60. 60 days until his father's death. 60 days until his father, Cho Gyeong-Ho, takes everything. Controlling stakes in 50 companies, 200,000 employees worldwide. Everything will pass to the man who set him up in the money laundering deal. The man who struck him from the Zhou family register so neatly, as if erasing a pencil mark in the margins. The gates clang. They herd him through 3 checkpoints. They take his fingerprints. They photograph him. At the 3rd checkpoint, they strip him naked and shove him under a stream of ice-cold water. The guy who was crying on the pier is crying even harder now. A guard hits him on the ear and tells him to shut up. Dae-Hyun stands under the water and doesn't shiver. It's cold. But he understands one thing right now, standing under that stream. Here, you can't show weakness. Here, weakness isn't just an inconvenience. Here, weakness is an invitation. His cell is in the Korean block, 2 by 3 meters, concrete, a wooden bunk, a toilet without a partition. Someone has scratched a row of lines into the wall. He counts them, 147. The previous inmate spent 147 days here. Then the lines ended. Either he was transferred, or there was no one left to keep counting. Dae-Hyun lies down. The mattress is as thin as a towel. He closes his eyes and recalls his last conversation with his father. Old man Cho Gyeong-Sok was wasting away in a ward at a private clinic in Gangnam. Cancer had consumed him in 8 months. From a man who weighed 90 kilograms and ran an empire while standing, a man weighing 50 kilograms who spoke in a whisper. But his eyes were the same. Hard. Clear. His father had said then that if anything happened, Dae-Hyun wouldn't die, that he would survive. Dae-Hyun had decided the old man was delirious from the morphine. Now he understands. His father knew. He knew his uncle was planning an attack, and yet he didn't stop it. That thought burns hotter than the cold. At 1 in the morning, the door opens, quietly, without a creak. The hinges had been oiled beforehand, so this was planned. 3 men enter. The big one strikes first. A fist slams into his stomach. Dae-Hyun folds in half and falls onto the concrete. The second one kicks him in the side. A crunch. A rib. Maybe 2. The world turns white. Then red. Then black. He came to on the floor, his face covered in his own blood. His left eye won't open. The camera is empty. The 3 of them left. And right then, something happens inside his head. Not magic, not a system, not a superpower. Something simpler and more terrifying. Clarity. Absolute, cold clarity. As if someone had wiped the dirty glass inside his skull clean, and the world beyond it became painfully sharp. He suddenly remembers everything, every detail. The fourth guard on the pier has newer boots than the rest. He's a new recruit. The man in gloves at the checkpoint lingered on his badge number. He recognized him. So they knew about him on the island even before he arrived. The big one struck with his knuckles, right in the solar plexus. His fist was in a specific stance. A former fighter. The second one delivered a spinning kick. Taekwondo. The Korean army. The third one didn't strike at all. The third one was guarding the exit. So the third one is the senior officer. The whole picture came together in 3 seconds. He used to do this at meetings. He'd walk into the room, look at the 12 faces, and within a minute, he'd know who was lying, who was afraid, who would sign anything just to go home. But those were meetings. But this is prison, and his brain is working 10 times faster. Because what's at stake now isn't a billion-dollar project. What's at stake is his life. He sits down. His ribs are screaming. Blood is drying on his chin. He stares at the wall marked with little lines. 147. He only needs 60. If he survives. $500,000 worth of cigarettes. That's what his head is worth. He found that out back on the boat when the guards were chatting, thinking the newbies couldn't hear them. $500,000. 5 years worth of salaries for half the inmates. For that kind of money, they'll kill anyone here, and not just once. Dae-Hyun stands up. He's swaying. He grabs the edge of the dead. He steadies his breathing. Every breath feels like a knife between his ribs. And he begins to think. Not about the pain. Not about fear. Not about his uncle, who's sleeping right now in a house worth $12 million and having sweet dreams. He's thinking about the system. Blackstone Isle is an organization. Every organization has a structure, a budget, resources, rival divisions, weak spots where you can apply leverage. For 6 years, he'd been taking companies apart and putting them back together, conducting factory audits, resolving crises at shipyards. A prison is a business too, a poorly run one, with corrupt management, with a budget shortfall and a shadow economy. He knows what to do with places like this. Morning comes at 6. The light flickers on. He washes his face with ice-cold water and looks at his reflection in a murky puddle. A bloodshot eye, a scrape on his cheekbone, a split lip. He steps out into the hallway. The Korean block is shuffling toward the dining hall. The men glance at his battered face, at his number, B447. A former billionaire. $500,000 walking around. He sees calculation in their eyes. They haven't decided yet what to do with him. The newcomer's spot is by the trash cans. The dirtiest table is next to the food waste bin. Dae-Hyun grabs a tray. He looks at the table by the trash can and heads the wrong way. He walks across the entire hall to the central table, to the table where Park Seung-Woo is sitting, the leader of the Korean bloc, 8 years on the island, a scar across his eyebrow, hands like a longshoreman's, the man who gave the order to beat him up last night. A hush falls over the dining hall. First, the nearby tables fall silent, then the ones farther away. 10 seconds later, 400 people are staring at the newcomer walking toward the leader's table with a tray and a black eye. Dae-Hyun approaches. There's one empty chair next to Seung-Woo. He sets down the tray. He sits down. He straightens his back. His ribs are burning. He doesn't let on. Seung-Woo turns his head. His eyes are heavy, calm. The eyes of a man who would kill without batting an eye. Dae-Hyun speaks up in a flat, monotonous voice, like at a Monday morning meeting when everyone wants to sleep. He says there are 412 Koreans on the island, 68 in the laundry room, 22 in the kitchen, the rest at the quarry. The laundry room and kitchen are run by Sung-Woo's people. The quarry is run by Choi's people from Block B. Every week, Choi extorts 2 packs of cigarettes from the Koreans for so-called protection of the newcomers. In the 5 years that Sung-Woo has been here, that adds up to 520 packs, half the annual budget for bribing the guards. He says he'll put an end to this in a week, without killing anyone. He'll simply renegotiate the arrangement. In return, he wants one thing. 3 nights a week, the light in his cell stays on until lights out. He needs to read. The silence becomes palpable. 400 pairs of eyes. Sung-Woo stares at him for 10 seconds. Dae-Hyun doesn't look away. He doesn't blink. 6 years of negotiations have taught him one thing. The moment you look away, you've lost. It doesn't matter what you said before. 10 seconds. Then, Sung-Woo breaks off a piece of his bread. He places it on Dae-Hyun's tray. In prison slang, that means one thing. Keep talking. Dae-Hyun doesn't smile. He doesn't nod. He doesn't say thank you. He just keeps going in the same even tone. And Sung-Woo listens. For the first time in 8 years on this island, he's listening to a newcomer. Sung-Woo listened for 7 minutes. He didn't interrupt. He didn't ask questions. He just watched and ate his porridge. His men at the table were silent too. One of them, the one sitting to the leader's right, was older than the rest. About 50. Wiry, a gaunt face, gray hair at the temples, eyes like 2 stones at the bottom of a river. Han Min-Jae, Sung-Woo's right-hand man. Dae-Hyun figured this out within the first 3 seconds. From the way the others didn't start eating until Min-Jae picked up his spoon. From the way Sung-Woo glanced briefly in his direction once before placing bread on Dae-Hyun's tray. Min-Jae didn't put anything down. He looked at Dae-Hyun as if he were staring at a cockroach that had learned to talk. Curious, but still a cockroach. When Dae-Hyun finished speaking, Sung-Woo wiped his hands on his robe and said one word. How? Dae-Hyun explained. Choi from Block B runs the quarry because he controls the distribution of tools. The warehouse issues pickaxes and hammers. The warehouse is guarded. But the guard at the warehouse named Sullivan plays cards every Thursday in the administration building. Dae-Hyun had seen the card debt in his eyes back on the pier. A man who loses money every week isn't loyal to his employer. He's loyal to whoever will pay off his debt. If we intercept Sullivan and offer him better terms, control of the warehouse will shift from Che's people to Sung-Woo's people. No bloodshed, no fuss. Just a different person handing out the pickaxes in the morning. Sung-Woo looked at Min-Jae. Min-Jae didn't react. That was his answer. The old man didn't approve. But he didn't object out loud either. So Sung-Woo could move forward. Sung-Woo stood up. He looked down at Dae-Hyun. He said the lights in the cell would stay on. 3 nights. On Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. If the plan with Che didn't work out in a week, the lights would go out. And not just the lights. Dae-Hyun nodded. Sung-Woo left. His men followed him out. Min-Jae was the last to leave. He lingered for a second next to Dae-Hyun. He didn't say anything. He just stood there. Dae-Hyun felt something cold emanating from the old man. Not a threat. Worse. Patience. Min-Jae knew how to wait. He waited for the newcomer to make a mistake. And newcomers always make mistakes. Dae-Hyun finished his porridge. It was bland and watery. Worse than the food at the Wharton student cafeteria. And that was bad. But he ate every last spoonful. Here, food is fuel. Not a pleasure. Not a luxury. He left the dining hall and headed toward the work blocks. On their first day, new recruits were sent to orientation. That meant they were led around the grounds and shown where everything was. A guard named Pierce led a group of 4 new recruits through the main areas: the work zone, the quarry, the laundry room, the kitchen, medical wing, the administrative building, solitary confinement. Pierce stopped at the solitary confinement cell and said that this is where those who break the rules end up. The rules were simple. Don't mess with the guards, don't try to contact the outside world, don't try to escape. Everything else was allowed: fights, trading, murders. The guards didn't interfere in internal disputes. They were paid to make sure no one escaped, not to make sure anyone survived. Dae-Hyun memorized everything: every turn in the hallway, every door, every cell, the distances between the buildings, the number of steps from the dining hall to the infirmary, 123. From the infirmary to the quarry, 241. From the quarry to the administrative building, 187. He was mapping it all out in his mind, just as he had once drawn up organizational charts of subsidiary companies before a takeover. During the orientation, he noticed something important. An elderly Korean man, about 60 years old, was standing at the entrance to the laundry room. Thin, stooped, his left eye was cloudy, a cataract. The old man was washing his robes by hand in a huge tub of hot water. His hands were red up to his elbows. He squinted and held the fabric up to his face to make out the stains. Almost blind in one eye and losing sight in the other, Dae-Hyun paused for a second. The guard told him to keep moving. He moved on, but he remembered. The old man from the laundry room. He needs eye medicine. There's medicine in the infirmary. The infirmary is a resource. A resource is leverage. After orientation, the new arrivals were assigned to their jobs. Dae-Hyun was sent to the quarry, Che's territory. It wasn't a coincidence. Someone wanted the 500,000 walkers to end up in an area where they'd be easier to get their hands on. The quarry was an open area on the northern side of the island. Rock, stone, dust, wind from the sea. The prisoners chiseled away at the rock with pickaxes and loaded the pieces into wheelbarrows. Dae-Hyun didn't understand why they were doing this. The stone wasn't being taken anywhere. The wheelbarrows were unloaded at the other end of the site, and the stones lay there in piles. Meaningless labor, punishment for punishment's sake, or a way to keep 200 people occupied so they wouldn't sit in their cells and plan a riot. He picked up a pickaxe. It was heavy, about 4 kilograms. The handle was wooden, polished by thousands of hands until it was as smooth as glass. His ribs ached with every swing. He struck the stone and counted the blows. At the same time, he counted the people around him. About 180 people were working at the quarry. Of those, roughly 100 were Koreans. The rest were from various blocks. The overseers were from Che's group, 4 of them, all burly, all with homemade blades hidden in the tops of their boots. Dae-Hyun could see the outlines of the blades through the fabric. Che himself showed up an hour later, a short, stocky Korean, about 45 years old, a round face, small eyes. His movements were slow and he walked past Dae-Hyun without even glancing at him. But 2 of his men did look, intently, appraisingly. They knew who B447 was. Everyone knew. By noon, Dae-Hyun had fully grasped the structure of the quarry. Che controlled the tools through the supply room. He controlled the brakes through his overseers. He controlled the water. The barrel of drinking water stood in the shade of the awning, and one could only approach it with permission from Che's men. Water 3 times a day. In the morning, at noon, in the evening. Anyone who didn't make it in time drank from a puddle or went without. Water, tools, brakes. 3 points of control. Dae-Hyun struck a rock with his pickaxe and, at that moment, saw a 4th. medical care. Every day at the quarry, someone was injured. Cuts, bruises, broken fingers. Sometimes worse. The nurse came to the quarry once a day at 2 o'clock. She bandaged those who were brought to her. The rest waited until evening, or didn't wait at all. The nurse. He saw her at 2 o'clock. She came with a medical bag slung over her shoulder. Not very tall, black hair pulled back into a tight ponytail, a white lab coat over gray clothes. Her face was calm, professional. She was bandaging a man with a cut on his palm and didn't flinch at the sight of blood. Her hands moved quickly and precisely. Choi Yuna. He heard the name when one of the inmates called out to her. She didn't react to the name. She looked up only when they called her a second time. She was used to people addressing her not by name, by title, or by number, or not at all. Dae-Hyun turned away and went back to work. He remembered. A nurse. She comes at 2, alone, without a guard, with a medical bag containing bandages, antiseptic, and painkillers. Painkillers are currency. Bandages are currency. Everything here is currency. By evening, his ribs ached so much that he couldn't straighten up completely. But he worked a full shift, 10 hours, like everyone else. That was important. A new recruit who complains is fair game. A rookie who works like everyone else, that's no one yet. Better to be no one than fair game. In the cafeteria at dinner, he sat in the spot for rookies by the trash can, not at Son-Woo's table. Once was enough. A second time would look like an attempt to brown nose, and brown nosers don't last long on the island. He ate rice with some kind of stewed mush they called meat and watched. The mess hall was a map of power. Each table was a territory. The Korean block was in the center. The American block was by the windows. Sitting there was a man everyone called Doc, Marcus Riley, a former military doctor. Dae-Hyun watched him from across the room. A tall, thin man in his 50s with a neatly trimmed beard and thin-framed glasses. A surgeon's hands, long fingers, calm movements. He ate slowly and neatly, as if he were sitting in a restaurant rather than a prison cafeteria. Doc was a poisoner. Dae-Hyun had learned this from snippets of conversation at the quarry. A former military doctor who knew how to kill a person so that it looked like a heart attack, or a stroke, or an allergic reaction. People feared him more than those who fought with their fists, because you can dodge a fist, but not a pill in your food. The Russian bloc sat against the far wall. There weren't many of them, about 30 men, but they took up as much space as 60. Broad-shouldered, loud. They ate greedily and quickly. Dae-Hyun hadn't identified him yet. There was another table, a strange one. 6 people, not sitting next to each other, scattered throughout the hall. But they ate in unison, the same rhythm, the same tilt of the head. They all swirled their mugs the same way before drinking. A synchrony they themselves probably didn't notice, but Dae-Hyun noticed. Ghosts. 6 people with no clear affiliation to any specific block, who were working on a direct order. The order could only have come from one person, Uncle, through a bribed deputy warden. Dae-Hyun finished his dinner. He returned to his cell. It was Monday. The light was on, just as Seung-Woo had promised. Dae-Hyun lay down on the bunk. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, to work. He began to construct an organizational chart of Blackstone Isle in his head. At the top was the prison administration, the warden whom he had never seen, the deputy warden who had been bribed by his uncle, the guards, about 80 of them, divided into shifts, day and night. Below them were the prisoner blocks, Korean, American, Russian. A few others he hadn't classified yet. Each block had its own hierarchy, its own resources, its own currency. Trade relations and conflicts existed between the blocks. Separately, the ghosts. 6 people who answered not to the block leaders, but to an outside client. He saw this entire structure as clearly as if it had been drawn with a marker on a whiteboard in the conference room. And he saw the bottlenecks: water at the quarry, medical supplies, security guard Sullivan's card debt, the blind old man in the laundry room, the nurse who comes alone and unescorted. Every bottleneck was a point of leverage. Every lever was a step toward moving from the extraction category to the asset category. He had 59 days. He fell asleep at midnight when the lights turned off automatically. And for the first time in 2 days, he slept soundly, because he had a plan. On the third day, Dae-Hyun started working, not with a pickaxe, with his head. Sullivan was on duty at the quarry warehouse on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. Today was Tuesday. Dae-Hyun arrived for his shift and immediately found a spot in the row closer to the warehouse. He worked in silence. He struck the stone, he counted the blows, and he watched. Sullivan was a burly Irishman with a red face and the eyes of a man who doesn't sleep well. He wore a watch on his left wrist, an expensive one, not the kind they issue to prison guards. So it must have been a gift or a purchase. But where would a prison guard get a watch worth $2,000? Only if he was taking money from both sides. A salary from the administration, under-the-table income from the inmates. But the under-the-table income went through Che, and Che was taking too large a cut. Dae-Hyun could tell by the way Sullivan would grimace every time Che's men walked by. A micro-expression, a fraction of a second, but it was enough. By lunchtime, Dae-Hyun had set up a contact, not directly, through a third party. In the Korean wing, there was a guy named Nam Tae-Seong, 23 years old, small, quick, in for fraud. On the island, he worked as a courier. He carried notes and small packages between the blocks for a cut. Dae-Hyun found him during a break. He sat down next to him. He asked how much Tae-Seong earned a week. Tae-Seong said 3 cigarettes. Dae-Hyun said he'd pay 5 if Tae-Seong passed on a proposal to Sullivan. Tae-Seong looked at him with interest. 5 cigarettes was good pay. Dae-Hyun dictated the proposal. A man from the Korean bloc wants to meet. It's a business conversation. No witnesses. In exchange for the meeting, half of the card debt will be written off. Tae-Seong asked how Dae-Hyun found out about the card debt. Dae-Hyun said that a man who loses every Thursday can't hide it on Fridays. On Fridays, his right eye twitched and he smoked more often. Tae-Seong left. He returned 2 hours later. Sullivan agreed to the meeting. Tomorrow, the warehouse, 6 in the morning, before the shift starts. Dae-Hyun nodded. He gave Tae-Seong 5 cigarettes from the pack he'd been issued. His first investment. That afternoon, an incident occurred at the quarry. One of Choi's men approached Tae-Hyun from behind. He stood close. He was breathing down the back of his neck. He didn't hit him. He just stood there. A test. Pressure. Psychological. You feel someone's presence behind you, and either you turn around, which means you're showing you're nervous, or you speed up your work, which means you're obeying, or you freeze, which means you're afraid. Dae-Hyun continued chipping away at the stone at the same rhythm. He didn't turn around. He didn't speed up. He didn't freeze. He just kept going. A minute later, the man left. A small victory. But on the island, there are no small victories. Everyone sees everything. By evening, half the quarry knew that the newcomer, B447, hadn't flinched when Mr. Che was standing behind him. That was information. Information was capital. After dinner, Dae-Hyun approached the cell of the elderly Korean man from the laundry. The old man's name was Kwon Byung-chul. He was 62. He was serving time for something related to labor unions. His left eye was almost blind. His right eye was losing its sight. In a year, he'd be completely blind if he didn't receive treatment. Dae-Hyun crouched down at the entrance to his cell. He introduced himself. He said he wanted to help. The old man looked at him with cloudy eyes and asked why. Dae-Hyun told the truth. He said he needed people in the laundry room who would trust him. The laundry room was a source of information. You can learn a lot from dirty clothes. Who has blood on their robe? Who has new clothes? Who received contraband? The old man was silent for a moment. Then he asked what Dae-Hyun could offer in return. Dae-Hyun said he'd get him some eye drops, not painkillers, real medicinal drops with antibiotics. The old man smirked. He said the drops were worth 30 cigarettes. Dae-Hyun said he knew, and that in a week, he'd have 30 cigarettes. The old man looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded. He told him to come back when he had them. Dae-Hyun left, his second contact of the day. He didn't have any cigarettes yet, but he would. The next morning, he arrived at the warehouse at 5:50. It was dark. It was cold. The wind from the sea carried a salty mist. Sullivan was already inside. He was standing by the rack of pickaxes, smoking. Dae-Hyun walked in. He closed the door. Sullivan looked at him. He asked who he was and how he knew about the debt. Dae-Hyun sat down on a crate. He looked at Sullivan. 3 seconds were enough. Sullivan was afraid, not of Dae-Hyun, of Choi. He owed Choi's men 3 months' worth of losses, not just cigarettes. The debt had been converted into services. Choi forced him to turn a blind eye to certain things, small things at first, then bigger ones. Now Sullivan was so deeply in Choi's pocket that there was only one way out, if someone else pulled him out of there. Dae-Hyun spoke for 10 minutes, calmly, methodically. He explained 3 things to Sullivan. First, his debt to Choi amounted to about 120 cigarettes. Dae-Hyun will pay off this debt in full. Not right now, in 10 days. Second, in exchange, Sullivan will start working with the Korean crew. Not against Choi, just alongside him. Tool distribution will follow a new schedule. The Korean crew will receive their pickaxes 15 minutes earlier. Those 15 minutes mean the opportunity to work the best sections of the quarry, where the rock is softer and the quota can be met faster. Meeting the quota faster means more free time. More free time means more opportunities for trading. Third, if Sullivan refuses, Dae-Hyun won't threaten him. He won't bring up the debt. He'll just walk away. But then, in 3 months, Choi will ask him to do something that will make Sullivan unable to look at himself in the mirror. Dae-Hyun knew this because he'd seen it happen in the corporate world. When you're slowly being dragged into a swamp, you don't realize you're drowning until the mud reaches your chin. Sullivan was silent. He finished his cigarette. He took out a second one. He lit it. His hands were shaking. Dae-Hyun waited. He didn't pressure him. Putting pressure on him now would be a mistake. Sullivan had to make the decision himself, because a decision you make on your own is stronger than one that's forced upon you. Sullivan asked where a prisoner would get 120 cigarettes in 10 days. Dae-Hyun said it wasn't his problem. He said that if there were no cigarettes in 10 days, Sullivan would be free of any obligations, but if there were, the deal would go through. Sullivan finished his second cigarette. He said, "All right." He said, 10 days. And he left. Dae-Hyun stayed behind on the crate. He sat in the darkness of the warehouse and thought. 120 cigarettes in 10 days. He had 0 right now, minus the 5 he'd given to Tae-Seong, so minus 5. 125 cigarettes in 10 days. On an island where every cigarette counts and where 500,000 is offered for his head, 500,000. The task seemed impossible. But there are no impossible tasks. There are only tasks with variables that haven't been fully accounted for. He left the warehouse. The morning sky over the island was gray and heavy. The sea roared. The wind carried the scent of seaweed and diesel fuel. Dae-Hyun walked toward the cafeteria, thinking about cigarettes, about barter, about how to turn nothing into something. And then he remembered. Wharton, sophomore year, Professor Stanfield, a course on non-standard financial instruments. Stanfield had talked about service banks in economies with limited liquidity, systems where the currency is not an object, but a promise. You deposit a service, I guarantee a return. Interest is accrued not in money, but in services. The bank doesn't hold assets, the bank holds trust. There was no bank on the island. There was a barter system, chaotic, unpredictable, without guarantees. You trade a cigarette for bread, but there's no certainty that the exchange rate will be the same tomorrow. No arbitrage. No insurance. No reputational capital. A bank needs startup capital. To get startup capital, you need a first transaction. For the first transaction, you need to find two people, the one who has something and someone who needs it. Dae-Hyun found both of them on the fifth day. The first was On Ba-ram, 34 years old, Korean, a former chef from Busan. He'd served time for manslaughter. He worked in the cafeteria kitchen. Ba-ram had access to salt. That sounded ridiculous on the outside, but on the island, salt was in short supply. The food was bland, porridge without salt, rice without salt, canned meat without salt. Officially, salt was issued to the kitchen in limited quantities. The cooks used it for cooking and kept some for themselves. Small paper packets of salt cost 2 cigarettes each. Ba-ram sold 3 packets a week. He could have sold 10, but he didn't, a reliable distribution channel. He simply offered it quietly to acquaintances and was afraid the kitchen overseers would find out. The second was Kozlov, a Russian, in his 50s, huge as a wardrobe, with eyes that expressed nothing but boredom. Kozlov was from the Russian bloc but worked alone. He fixed everything. Pipes, electrical work, locks, hinges. The guards used his services because the prison's official repairman had started drinking heavily 6 months ago and hadn't come out of his binge since. Kozlov accepted cigarettes and contraband tea as payment for his work. But he had a problem. He needed salt. A lot of salt. Not for eating. Kozlov was distilling moonshine from prison compote and rice. The salt was used in the filtration process. Without salt, the moonshine was cloudy and had an off flavor. With salt, it became clear. Clear moonshine cost 3 times as much as the cloudy kind. Kozlov needed 5 packets of salt a week. Ba-ram could provide them. But they didn't know each other. They worked in different zones. They lived in different blocks. Their paths never crossed. Dae-Hyun brought them together. Not in person, through Tae-Seong. The terms were simple. Ba-ram would supply Kozlov with 5 packets of salt a week. Kozlov would pay Ba-ram 12 cigarettes a week. Through Tae-Hyun as the guarantor. Dae-Hyun's cut was 3 cigarettes a week. Tae-Seong got 1 for delivery. So Dae-Hyun ended up with a net profit of 2 cigarettes a week. Not much, but it was his first step. He closed this deal on the 5th day. On the 6th, he found a second one. An American named Wallace wanted a razor blade, not as a weapon, for shaving. Wallace had a skin infection, and the dull prison razors were making it worse. He needed a sharp blade, not as a weapon, but for shaving. Wallace had a skin infection, and the dull prison razors were making it worse. He needed a sharp blade. Choi's people had the blades. They sold them for 10 cigarettes. But Wallace was from the American bloc, and buying directly from the Chos meant paying a double markup for interblock trade, 20 cigarettes. Dae-Hyun found another source. In the laundry room, an old man named Kwon told him that razor blades sometimes end up in the laundry, inside the pockets of the prison uniforms. One of the laundry workers collects them and sells them for 5 cigarettes each. Dae-Hyun bought a blade for 5 cigarettes, which he didn't have. He promised to pay in 3 days. He sold it to Wallace for 12. He didn't have any of those either. Wallace will pay Tae-Seong on Thursday. Tae-Seong will pass the money on to Dae-Hyun on Friday. Dae-Hyun will settle his debt for the razor blade on Saturday. 7 cigarettes net, -1 for Tae-Seong. 6. Over the course of 2 days, he made 4 more deals like this. Small ones. An extra bowl of porridge over there. A spot in the shade by the wall at the quarry here. 1 painkiller for 2 cigarettes. Each deal netted him between 2 and 5 cigarettes, and each deal set a precedent. People were beginning to realize that exchanges could be made safely through B447, without the risk of being ripped off, without a markup for interblock trade. On the 7th day, Min-Jae came to his cell, without knocking. He sat down on the bunk across from him. He stared at him for a long time. Then he said that Dae-Hyun was playing a dangerous game, that he'd seen others like him before, smart boys from good families who thought they could outsmart the island. They all ended up the same way, with a blade between their ribs in a dark corridor. Dae-Hyun listened. He didn't argue. He didn't make excuses. When Min-Jae finished, Dae-Hyun asked how long he'd been serving his sentence. Min-Jae said 11 years. Dae-Hyun asked if he'd seen his daughter during that time. Min-Jae froze. His face turned to stone. He asked how Dae-Hyun knew about his daughter. Dae-Hyun said that on the inside of Min-Jae had a name tattooed on the inside of his left wrist. Sori. A girl's name. Not his wife's name, because married men get wedding rings or initials tattooed. They get their daughters' full names tattooed, especially if the daughter was born while you were already in prison, or if you lost her. Min-Jae stared at him. 10 seconds. 20. Dae-Hyun held his ground. Min-Jae stood up. He left. He didn't say a word. But he didn't hit him either. Dae-Hyun exhaled as the footsteps faded down the hallway. It had been dangerous. He'd poked his finger right into the old wolf's most vulnerable spot. But he'd poked gently, not to cause pain, to show that he could see, and that this vision was not a weapon, but a bridge. Maybe Min-Jae would understand that. Or maybe he'd come back at night with a knife. 50-50. But without risk, there's no leverage. On the 8th day, something happened that changed the dynamics. Choi found out about the deal with Sullivan. Not the details, just the fact itself. Someone from the quarry had seen Tae-Seong pass a note to a guard. Cho sent his men, 2 of them. They found Tae-Seong in the corridor between the blocks. They broke 3 fingers on his left hand and left a note, a square piece of paper with a single word. Stop. Dae-Hyun found out an hour later. He went to see Tae-Seong in his cell. The guy was sitting on the bunk, holding his broken fingers pressed against his chest. He wasn't crying, but his face was ashen. Dae-Hyun looked at the fingers, the index, middle, and ring fingers. His left hand. His dominant hand, since he was left-handed. And Tae-Seong was left-handed. So Choi knew that. So they'd broken them on purpose. He told Tae-Seong it was his fault, that he hadn't calculated the risk, that Tae-Seong would receive compensation. Tae-Seong said he didn't need compensation. He needed his fingers to heal properly. If they healed crooked, he wouldn't be able to work as a courier. And being a courier is everything he has on the island. Dae-Hyun nodded. He said his fingers would heal properly. He knew who could make that happen. Nurse Yuna. But to do that, he had to get into the infirmary and have something to offer in return. He went to the infirmary at 2 o'clock, the time when Yuna was at the quarry. That meant only one orderly was on duty at the infirmary, an elderly Filipino named Carlos. Dae-Hyun approached him and said he needed his ribs bandaged. Carlos looked at him and asked for his number. Dae-Hyun told him. Carlos wrote it down in the log. While Carlos was bandaging his ribs, Dae-Hyun looked around the infirmary. 3 beds, a cabinet with medications. The lock on the cabinet was simple, a 4-digit combination lock. On Yuna's desk stood a framed photograph, a man in a surgical gown, around 50 years old, her father. His face was stern, but his eyes were kind. Next to the photo stood a cup with the remains of tea. The tea had long since gone cold, so Yuna had forgotten to finish it, or didn't want to. Next to the cup lay a notebook, open. There were notes on the page. Dae-Hyun read them from top while Carlos fiddled with the bandage. A list of patients, names, diagnoses, notes. Among the notes, he saw a line that made him hold his breath. Block C, Cell 17. Seo Jong-Il, age 72. Diagnosis, chronic angina. Note, requires weekly examination. Restricted access by order of the administration. Seo Jong-Il, a man in solitary confinement. A man whom the guards fear more than anyone else. A man who, 20 years ago, had been his father's best friend. Dae-Hyun didn't let on. He thanked Carlos. He walked out and stopped in the hallway. He leaned against the wall. His ribs ached. But that wasn't what made him stop. His father knew that Seo Jong-Il was on the island. Of course he knew. His father knew everything. His father planned his moves 20 years in advance. If Dae-Hyun ended up here and Seo Jong-Il had been imprisoned here for 20 years, it was no coincidence. Nothing in Cho Kyung-sok's world was a coincidence. On the 9th day, Dae-Hyun asked Seung-Woo for a meeting. Not in the dining hall, in Seung-Woo's cell. Seung-Woo agreed. The block leader's cell was just like the others. 2 by 3, a bunk bed, a toilet. But on the wall hung a calendar torn from a magazine. A real mattress lay on the bunk. And Seung-Woo had a table, a small wooden table that no one else had. A privilege of authority. Dae-Hyun sat down on a chair. Seung-Woo sat on the bunk. Min-Jae stood by the door. Dae-Hyun placed a pack of cigarettes on the table. 20 cigarettes. Everything he'd earned in 4 days of trading. Seung-Woo looked at the pack, then at Dae-Hyun. Dae-Hyun said it wasn't a gift. It was an investment. He needed to borrow 100 cigarettes from Seung-Woo for 7 days at 20% interest. In 7 days, he'd pay back 120. Seung-Woo asked why he needed 100. Dae-Hyun explained. Sullivan, Choi's debt, control of the warehouse. Seung-Woo remained silent. Min-Jae snorted from the doorway. He said that lending 100 cigarettes to a newbie who'd been on the island for 9 days was madness. Dae-Hyun turned to Min-Jae. He looked at him and said that Min-Jae was absolutely right, that it was madness. But he asked what exactly Min-Jae was proposing instead. To keep paying Che 2 packs a week, for another year, for another 5 years, until Che had squeezed the entire Korean block dry. Myung-jae clenched his jaw. Seung-Woo raised his hand. Myung-jae fell silent. Seung-Woo said he'd give 100 cigarettes, but not at 20%, at 50. 150 cigarettes in 7 days, or Dae-Hyun's head. Dae-Hyun nodded. He didn't haggle. 50% in 7 days was robbery. But time was worth more than the percentage. He took the 100 cigarettes in a canvas bag. He left Seung-Woo's cell and carried them to Tae-Seong. On the way, he did the math in his head. 20 of his own plus 100 from Seung-Woo, minus 5 for Tae-Seong. 115. He needed 120 for Sullivan, plus 50 for Seung-Woo. 170. He had 115, a shortfall of 55. In 7 days, a little over 7 cigarettes a day, net. Tough. But it's possible. If I speed up the trade, if I find new pairs for deals, If I make at least 3 trades every day. His ribs ached. His left eye finally opened all the way. His hands were calloused from the pickaxe. His fingernails were broken. He weighed 2 kilograms less than he had 9 days ago. And he felt alive. The 10th day began with blood. Not his. In the dining hall at breakfast, 2 men from the Russian bloc got into a fight with a man from the American bloc. The reason was trivial, a spot in line at the food distribution. But on the island, there are no trivial reasons. Every skirmish is a signal, a territorial dispute, a test of boundaries. One of the Russians hit the American in the face with a tray. The plastic cracked. Blood spattered onto the floor. The second Russian kicked him. The American fell. 2 more men from his block ran over to him. A brawl broke out. Security intervened 3 minutes later. 3 minutes is an eternity when 4 men are beating each other on a floor wet with porridge. By the time the batons had dispersed the crowd, one of the Russians was lying motionless. The American was coughing up blood. 2 were taken to solitary confinement. Dae-Hyun sat at a table by the trash can and watched. He wasn't looking at the fighters. He was watching those who were watching the fighters. Seung-Woo was eating and didn't look up, so he knew what was coming. Or maybe he didn't care. Choi was smiling, a subtle smile, so it was to his advantage. Why? Because the fight between the Russians and the Americans was diverting attention away from his block. Doc Riley from the American corner watched the brawlers from behind his glasses. His face was calm, but his right hand lay on the table, fingers pointing down, ready. He was weighing whether to intervene. He decided not to. He withdrew his hand, and the 6 ghosts, Dae-Hyun found them with his eyes. One was sitting by the window. The second was by the wall on the right. The third was 2 tables away from the Korean section. All 3 were looking not at the fight, but at Dae-Hyun. He sensed it before he saw it. Eyes on his back, pressure on the back of his neck. They were watching him, assessing him, waiting for the right moment. The fight ended. The dining hall was cleaned up. Life went on. But Dae-Hyun gleaned more information from those 3 minutes than from an entire day at the quarry. The Russian and American blocks are on the brink of conflict. Che is exploiting this. The ghosts are active and watching him constantly. That means Uncle recently sent new instructions. Time is running out. After breakfast, he closed 2 deals. The first, a man from the South Asian bloc wanted to transfer from the quarry to the laundry. The official transfer required a bribe of 15 cigarettes for the guard. Through Dae-Hyun and old man Kwon from the laundry, the transfer cost 8. Dae-Hyun's cut was 3. Second, someone from the American bloc was looking for an antibiotic. He'd injured his hand in a fight. The medical ward only dispensed antibiotics with Yuna's authorization. But Yuna didn't come in until 2. By 2, the wound could have become infected. Dae-Hyun got 2 pills through Carlos from the medical ward. They cost 5 cigarettes. He sold them for 9. That left him with 4, minus 1 for Carlos. 3. By noon on the 10th day, he had 121 cigarettes, exactly 1 more than he needed for Sullivan. He sent Tae-Seong. He couldn't use his left hand. His fingers were wrapped in a rag. But with his right hand, he held the bag of cigarettes tightly. Tae-Seong handed Sullivan 120. Sullivan counted them. He nodded. The deal was done. Starting tomorrow, the Korean bloc would get their pickaxes 15 minutes earlier. Control of the warehouse was shifting. Quietly. No bloodshed. Not a single blow. When Tae-Seong returned and said everything had gone smoothly, Dae-Hyun felt his brain start to slow down. His blood pressure dropped. The stakes had lowered. His body presented the bill. His hands began to tremble. It was petty and disgusting, as if someone had sent an electric current through his forearms. He felt nauseous. He barely managed to run to the toilet in his cell. Vomit. Bile. His empty stomach was turning inside out. He knelt by the toilet and waited for it to pass. That was the price. His brain had been working at its limit for 9 days straight. Hyperoptimization demanded fuel. The fuel was pressure. When the pressure dropped, the system shut down, and his body paid for all the hours his brain had on credit. 30 minutes on the cell floor. Then he stood up, washed his face, lay down on the bunk, closed his eyes. He needed to rest for at least an hour, because the second half of the task lay ahead. 50 Sun-Yu cigarettes in 6 days. He slept for 2 hours. He woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, unfamiliar. The footsteps stopped at his cell. The door opened. Standing in the doorway was a guard he hadn't seen before. Young, Asian, an expressionless face. The guard said that inmate B-447 was being transferred to another cell by order of the deputy warden. Dae-Hyun understood instantly. Uncle. Every 2 weeks, conditions got worse. Today was the 14th day. The new cell turned out to be on the first floor of Block D, not the Korean block, a mixed one. This is where those who weren't accepted by their own people. The cell was smaller than the previous one, 1 meter by 2.5. The bunks were shorter. There was no mattress at all, just bare metal. And a cellmate. In the cell across from him, separated by a slatted wall, sat a man. Dae-Hyun saw him, and everything inside him tensed up. The man was large, bald, tattoos on his neck and arms. His eyes were empty, yet cheerful at the same time, like a child who tears the wings off flies. A maniac. The guard had put him right next to a maniac. Very elegant. The man looked at Dae-Hyun through the bars. He smiled. He said his name was Greg. He asked the newcomer how he was sleeping. Dae-Hyun didn't answer. He lay down on the bare bunk. He closed his eyes. But he wasn't asleep. Every sound from the cell across the way passed through him like an electric shock. Greg was muttering something under his breath, a melody, quiet and monotonous, like a lullaby for himself. Dae-Hyun lay there and thought. Being transferred out of the Korean block was a blow. He was losing direct access to Seung-Woo, losing the cell with the light, losing his closeness to his own people. His uncle was putting pressure on him, but that pressure was fuel. His brain kicked into gear again, clear, fast. He began to reassess his position. Block D, new territory, new people, new opportunities for trade, new connections that didn't exist in the Korean bloc. The transfer isn't just a loss, it's an expansion of his network, if used correctly. On the morning of the 11th day, he left his cell in Block D and headed to the dining hall. Across the entire island, past Block C, past the solitary confinement cells, past cell number 17. He slowed his pace. The door was made of steel, with a small window at eye level. The window was covered by a shutter on the outside, but Dae-Hyun heard breathing behind the door. Steady, slow. The breathing of an old man who had long since grown accustomed to being alone. Seo Jong-Il, 72 years old. He's been sitting here for a long time. The guards are afraid of him. His father knew he was here, and Dae-Hyun ended up here too. No coincidence. He kept walking. Not now. It's too early. First, he had to settle Seung-Woo's debt, then deal with the ghosts, and only then the old man. In the dining hall, he sat down at a table in Block D. Unfamiliar faces, different nationalities, no hierarchy. Block D was a dumping ground. They dumped those they had nowhere else to put here. No structure, no leader, no rules, chaos. But chaos is a system too, just one with a lot of variables. During lunch, a man of about 35 sat down next to him, skinny, nervous. His fingers were constantly moving, drumming on the table. He said his name was Bae Jin-ho, that he'd heard about B447, that he needed help. Dae-Hyun asked what kind. Jin-Ho said he needed to get a letter to the mainland, to his wife. The official channels were closed. The administration wouldn't let his mail through. He didn't know why, but he hadn't been able to contact his wife for 8 months. He didn't know if she was alive. He didn't know if their child had been born. Jin-Ho's hands were shaking, not from the cold. It was from the despair he'd been carrying inside him for 8 months. Despair that had finally found someone to turn to. Dae-Hyun looked at him for 3 seconds. Jin-Ho wasn't lying. His eyes were red from lack of sleep. His fingernails were bitten down to the flesh. His left leg twitched constantly under the table. A man on the brink. Dae-Hyun said he'd help, but he needed time. Jin-Ho asked how much. Dae-Hyun said a week. Jin-Ho nodded. He asked how he could pay. He had nothing. No cigarettes, no connections. Dae-Hyun said payment would come later, when Dae-Hyun needed something. Jin-Ho would agree to that. Jin-Ho nodded quickly, almost desperately. Dae-Hyun stood up and left. On the way, a plan took shape in his mind. A letter to the mainland. For that, he'd need a guard willing to smuggle out an envelope. Sullivan could do it. But Sullivan was already on the job, and overloading a single channel was dangerous. He needed a second one. That evening, he returned to Block D. Greg across the way was singing his lullaby again. Dae-Hyun lay down on the bunk. The metal was cold and hard. He pulled a pencil stub, which he'd picked up at the quarry, out of his prison robe pocket, and he began to draw on the wall. A small diagram. Names, lines of connection, resources, nodes. The Blackstone Isle organizational chart, version 2, revised. He himself stood at the center, B447. Lines extended from him to Seung-Woo, to Sullivan, to Kwon from the laundry, to Tae-Seong, to Carlos from the medical ward, to Bahram from the kitchen, to Kozlov, to Wallace, to Jin-Ho. 9 connections in 11 days. Each connection was a thread. The threads wove together into a web. The web was still thin and fragile. A single blow could tear it apart, but it existed, and every day it grew denser. He smudged the diagram with his palm. He couldn't leave any traces. He lay down. He closed his eyes. Through the wall, Greg stopped singing. Silence. And then Greg said quietly, almost in a whisper, that he'd seen Dae-Hyun drawing, and that it was a beautiful web. Dae-Hyun opened his eyes. He looked into the darkness. Greg was staring at him through the bars. His eyes were gleaming, like a caged animal that had caught the scent of something interesting. Dae-Hyun didn't answer, but he understood. Greg wasn't just a maniac. Greg is watching. Greg sees. And Greg might be part of the game his uncle is playing. The 12th day. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Yuna showed up at the quarry with a medical bag, as usual. Dae-Hyun walked up to her. He said that one of the inmates in the Korean block had 3 broken fingers on his left hand, that he needed professional treatment, a splint, a bandage, proper alignment. Yuna looked at him. Her expression was calm. Her voice was steady. She said the medical ward was open for appointments, that the injured man could come in. Dae-Hyun said the injured man was afraid to come because the people who broke his fingers know the infirmary schedule. Yuna paused. She looked him in the eyes for the first time. Not at his number, not at his face, into his eyes. Dae-Hyun held her gaze. She said she would come to the cell in the Korean wing that evening, after 6. Make sure the victim is there. Dae-Hyun nodded. He said thank you. She didn't reply. She turned and walked over to the next wounded man. Dae-Hyun watched her go. Her back was straight. Her stride was confident. The medical bag was slung over her shoulder. She carried that bag the way a soldier carries a weapon, out of habit and without pleasure. That evening, Yuna came. She found Tae-Seong in his cell. She examined his fingers. She applied a splint. She wrapped it with a bandage. She said that in 3 weeks, if he didn't move his arm, his fingers would heal properly. Tae-Seong looked at her with an expression that Dae-Hyun had only seen in people who receive help when they've given up hope. Gratitude mixed with distrust. Yuna packed up her bag. She left. At the cell door, she stopped. She turned to Dae-Hyun. She said the bandage on his ribs had come loose, that he should come to the infirmary tomorrow morning before 8. She would rebandage him. Dae-Hyun said, okay. She left. Tae-Seong looked at Dae-Hyun. He said that nurses don't usually go into cells, that she took a risk for the sake of a stranger. Dae-Hyun said she wasn't doing it for the prisoner. She was doing it for her fingers, because she's a doctor. And for a doctor, malformed fingers are a personal insult. Tae-Seong thought about it and said that Dae-Hyun was probably right. Dae-Hyun didn't answer. He was thinking about how Yuna had told him to come before 8, not during working hours, before the shift started. It wasn't just a bandage change. It was an invitation to talk without witnesses. Day 14, 12 o'clock noon. Dae-Hyun was walking from the quarry to the cafeteria, a long corridor between the work area and the living quarters. Dim light, concrete walls. He was walking alone. That was a mistake. You shouldn't walk alone through empty corridors. But he was thinking about the numbers and, for a second, forgot where he was. The blow came from behind, a heavy one, to the back of his head. The world swayed. He fell to his knees. A second blow to the side, his ribs, the very same ones, the ones that had only just begun to heal. The pain was white and blinding. He fell onto his side. A man was standing over him. His face was covered with a rag. But the boots. Dae-Hyun saw the boots. New. Clean. On an island where everything is dirty and old, clean boots mean only one thing. This man had received them recently, as payment, for a job, for a contract, to kill B447. The man pulled something out of his sleeve. It glinted. A blade. Homemade. Made from a piece of metal sharpened against concrete. He swung it. Dae-Hyun rolled out of the way. The blade struck the concrete floor. Sparks flew. The man swung again. Dae-Hyun managed to put his arm out. The blade sliced across his forearm. Not deep, but painful. Blood. He screamed. Not from the pain, on purpose, loudly. The echo reverberated down the hallway. The man flinched. He looked around. Footsteps. Someone was coming from the cafeteria. The man shoved the knife back into his sleeve. He turned around. He ran. 3 seconds later, he disappeared around the corner. Dae-Hyun was lying on the floor. His left arm was covered in blood. His ribs were screaming. The back of his head was buzzing. Someone from the American block approached him, asked what had happened. Dae-Hyun said he'd fallen, tripped. The American looked at the blood, at the cut, at his face. He didn't believe a word of it, but he didn't argue. He helped him up. Dae-Hyun made it to the medical unit. Yuna was there. She looked at his arm, at the blood, at his face. She didn't ask what had happened. Silently, she took his wrist and began to treat the wound. Her hands moved quickly and precisely. Antiseptic, bandage, pressure bandage. He sat on the stretcher and watched her work. The pain receded slowly. She finished bandaging him. She stood beside him, holding his hand, for a second longer than necessary, then let go. She said the cut wasn't deep. It would heal in a week. But if there were another one like this, it might not heal. Dae-Hyun understood. It wasn't medical advice. It was a warning. She saw what he saw, that they were hunting him, that the next time might be the last. He thanked her. He stood up and stopped in the doorway. He turned around. He asked why she worked here, on this island. Yuna looked at him for a long time. Her eyes were dark, deep, impenetrable. She said it was none of his business. Dae-Hyun nodded. He left. But he already knew the answer. He'd seen the photo on her desk. Her father in a surgical scrub. The morning of the 15th day. Dae-Hyun sat on the bunk in Block D and thought about the boots. New. Black. Army issue. On the island, only the guards wore those. So the killer must have gotten them from a guard. That meant someone on the security staff was working for the ghosts. Or was a ghost himself. He closed his eyes and ran through in his mind all the faces of the guards he'd seen over the past 2 weeks. 16 on the pier, another 12 at the inner checkpoints, 8 at the quarry, 5 at the administration building, 41 in total. Of those, there were the young one who transferred him to Block D, Carlos from the medical wing, 2 more on the night shifts, a young Asian man, the one who came with the transfer order, an expressionless face, precise movements, economical. Not like a typical guard who walks heavily and lazily, more like someone with training. Dae-Hyun made a mental note, an Asian guard. Need to check him out. Greg watched him through the bars. He was silent. He wasn't singing his lullaby. He was just watching. Dae-Hyun turned to him. He asked how long he'd been in here. Greg said 6 years. Dae-Hyun asked what he was in for. Greg smiled. He said it was for love, that he'd loved the wrong people, and not the way he was supposed to. His eyes sparkled. Dae-Hyun didn't press him for details. Instead, he asked if Greg had ever seen inmates wearing new boots. Greg tilted his head. He thought for a moment. He said he'd seen one 3 days ago. A man had walked past his cell at night, around 1 o'clock, wearing new boots. He was heading toward the administration building. Dae-Hyun asked what he looked like. Greg said he was of average height, skinny, short hair, a tattoo on his neck. Small. Looked like a number or a letter. Dae-Hyun nodded. Information. Greg had given him information. Not for free, of course. Greg was waiting for something in return. But he hadn't named his price yet. That was riskier than if he'd named it right away. The price that isn't stated outright usually turns out to be the highest. Dae-Hyun left the cell and headed for the dining hall. On the way, he stopped by the Korean wing. Tae-Seong was sitting on the bunk. His hand was in a splint. His fingers were swollen, but the bandage was clean. Yuna knew her stuff. Dae-Hyun asked if Tae-Seong could use his right hand. Tae-Seong said yes. Dae-Hyun asked him to find a man with a tattoo on his neck, a small one, something that looked like a number or a letter, of average height, skinny. Tae-Seong nodded. He said he'd look for him. Dae-Hyun gave him 2 cigarettes. In the cafeteria, he sat down at a table in Block D. He ate in silence. He was thinking. He needed 50 cigarettes in 5 days for Seung-Woo. He had 23. That left a shortfall of 27, a little over 5 a day. Dealing brought in 3 or 4. He needed a breakthrough, a qualitative change. Not just another deal involving salt and razor blades. Something bigger. He looked across the room at Doc Riley's table, the American block. A former military doctor, a poisoner, a man everyone feared. But a man who had a problem. Dae-Hyun had noticed it on his very first day. Doc wore glasses, thin frames, scratched lenses. He squinted when he read. He'd take off his glasses and rub the bridge of his nose every 10 minutes. His nearsightedness was getting worse. He needed new lenses. And getting new lenses on the island wasn't a matter of going to a pharmacy. It was contraband. Through security. For a fortune. Or through the medical unit, where there's an optical catalog and the option to order through the administration, if you know how to fill out the request. Dae-Hyun knew, because that morning in the medical unit, when Yuna was bandaging his arm, he'd seen the medical request forms on her desk. Official forms, with stamps. If Yuna submitted a request for contact lenses for a prisoner on medical grounds, the administration was obligated to process it. Medical requests were the only thing on the island that still operated by the rules, because the international organization that funded the infirmary required accountability. He finished his breakfast. He went to the infirmary. Yuna was there. She was sorting through bandages in the cabinet. She saw him. She looked at the bandage on his arm. She said it was too early to change it. Dae-Hyun said he hadn't come for a dressing change. He sat down on the stretcher. Yuna turned around. She crossed her arms over her chest. She waited. Dae-Hyun said he knew an inmate whose nearsightedness was getting worse. If he didn't order contact lenses through a medical request, in 6 months this man would begin to lose his vision irreversibly. He asked her to file the request. Yuna asked which inmate he was talking about. Dae-Hyun gave Doc Riley's number. Yuna raised an eyebrow. It was the only reaction she allowed herself. She asked why he wanted to help Riley. Dae-Hyun told her the truth, that Riley was dangerous, that there was a bounty on his head, that if Riley became indebted to him, he would cease to be a threat and become neutral, that it was a matter of survival. Yuna remained silent. 10 seconds. Dae-Hyun waited. She said she'd file the request if Dae-Hyun did something for her. He asked what? She said there was an elderly patient in a solitary confinement cell in Block C who needed a weekly checkup. The administration allowed her to visit him once every 2 weeks. She wants it to be once a week. To do that, she needs a report from the Block C guard stating that the patient's condition has worsened. If there's a report, the administration will increase the frequency of visits. Dae-Hyun understood instantly, with Jong-Il. Cell 17. Yuna had been treating the old man, and she wanted to see him more often. Not because his condition had worsened, but because she cared. Somewhere beneath her professional facade was a beating heart, and the old man in solitary had somehow found his way to it. Dae-Hyun said the report would be filed. Yuna nodded. She said she'd submit the request for contact lenses by evening. He left the medical unit. 2 birds with 1 stone. Contact lenses for Doc, access to Seo Jong-Il for herself. The report from the Block C guard. To do that, she needed to find the guard on duty at Block C, someone who had a price. Everyone has a price. The only question was the currency. The Block C guard turned out to be an elderly Irishman named O'Brien. 60 years old, 20 of those on the island. A quiet man who did his job and didn't meddle in other people's business. Dae-Hyun had been observing him for 2 days. He walked past Block C. He watched. O'Brien read books while on duty. Thick books with worn covers. Dae-Hyun got close enough to read the title. A historical biography. In English. Dae-Hyun found his approach. On the 17th day, he approached O'Brien. He introduced himself. O'Brien looked at him without interest. Dae-Hyun said he had access to books. Through acquaintances in the kitchen who received newspapers and magazines for kindling, books were sometimes mixed in with them. He could get O'Brien 1 book a week. In return, O'Brien would write a report stating that the patient in cell 17 required more frequent medical visits. O'Brien looked at him. He looked at cell 17. He looked back. He asked why he wanted the old man. Dae-Hyun said he wanted to talk to him. O'Brien smirked. He said the old man doesn't talk to anyone. In 20 years, he'd heard maybe 50 words from him. Dae-Hyun said he'd try. O'Brien shrugged. He said, "All right, 1 book a week, and keep the place clean." The report would be written tomorrow. Dae-Hyun returned to Doc Riley. Approaching the table in the American section was harder than approaching Seung-Woo's table, because the American section didn't play by Korean rules. There was no bread ritual here. Here, An uninvited guest could simply be poked in the arm with a fork, and everyone would just keep eating. Dae-Hyun chose a different path. Not the dining hall, the quarry. Doc came to the quarry once every 3 days. Not to work, to check things out. He was the unofficial doctor for the American bloc. He treated his own people for money. The medical bloc charged a lot and provided service slowly. Doc charged less and treated patients right away. Competition. On the 17th day, Doc came to the quarry. He sat down on a rock in the shade of the canopy. He took off his glasses, wiped them with the hem of his robe, squinted into the sun, put them back on. Dae-Hyun approached, sat down next to him, at arm's length, close enough to talk, far enough not to be a threat. Doc looked at him, calmly, appraisingly, like a doctor looking at a patient during an initial examination. Dae-Hyun said he had information that might be useful to Doc, and a favor that would be even more useful. Doc asked what kind of information. Dae-Hyun said he knew which guard was stealing medication from the medical supply room and selling it to Che's people. Dae-Hyun had seen this through old man Kwon from the laundry room. Traces of white powder were regularly found on one of the guards' uniforms. Not drugs, an antibiotic in powder form. The guard was taking it from Yuna's cabinet. This was important information for Doc because he was treating his own people and needed the medication. If he knew who was stealing it, he could either cut off the supply or eliminate the competition. Doc took off his glasses. He looked at Dae-Hyun without them, his nearsighted eyes slightly narrowed. He asked what he could do for him. Dae-Hyun said that a request for new eyeglass lenses had been submitted through the medical unit. A request for new eyeglass lenses had been filed through the medical unit. A medical request, an official one, under Doc's number. The lenses would arrive in 10 to 12 days, free of charge, through the health insurance program. Doc remained silent. He put his glasses back on. He looked at Dae-Hyun through the scratched lenses. He asked what Dae-Hyun wanted in return. Dae-Hyun said one thing: neutrality. The American bloc would not participate in the hunt for B-447. No contract for his head will be accepted or carried out by Doc's men. Doc thought for a minute, a whole minute. On the island, a minute of silence between two men at the quarry is a very long time. Then he said that neutrality was worth more than a pair of lenses. Dae-Hyun said he knew that. That's why he was offering not a one-time deal, but ongoing cooperation. A channel for supplying medications, through the medical unit, regularly, at prices lower than Choi's. Dok would treat his people better and more affordably. His standing in the American bloc would grow. Dae-Hyun would gain neutrality and safe passage through American territory. Dok held out his hand. Dae-Hyun shook it. The handshake was dry and brief, businesslike, emotionless. Two professionals closing a deal. On the 18th day, Dae-Hyun returned 150 cigarettes to Seung-Woo, right on time. Seung-Woo counted them. He looked at Dae-Hyun. For the first time in 2 weeks, there was something in his eyes other than calculation, something resembling respect. Not for the man, toward the result. Seung-Woo asked where Dae-Hyun had gotten the extra 50 for 5 days. Dae-Hyun said he'd earned it. Seung-Woo snorted. Min-Jae stood nearby. He was silent. But for the first time, he wasn't snorting or looking at him like he was a cockroach. He looked at him as if he were something incomprehensible. Not approvingly, but without his usual contempt. Dae-Hyun seized the moment. He said he wanted to offer Seung-Woo a partnership. Not subordination, a partnership. Dae-Hyun would be the shadow consigliere, an advisor, the one who calculates and plans. Seung-Woo would remain the leader, the face, the fist. But every decision would go through Dae-Hyun, because Dae-Hyun can calculate the consequences 3 moves ahead. And on the island, It's not the one who hits hardest who wins. It's the one who thinks further ahead. On the 19th day, Seung-Woo gave his answer. He came to Block D in person. That in itself was a statement. The leader of the Korean bloc goes to the newcomer, not the other way around. Seung-Woo sat down on Dae-Hyun's bunk. He looked at the camera, at the bare metal without a mattress, at the slatted wall behind which Greg was quietly humming his lullaby. He said he agreed, but on one condition. If Dae-Hyun ever made a decision that put the Korean bloc at risk for the sake of his own personal interests, Seung-Woo would personally slit his throat. No questions asked, no second chances. Dae-Hyun said he accepted. Seung-Woo stood up. As he was leaving the cell, he turned around. He said he'd brought a mattress, that it was in the hallway. Dae-Hyun looked. A rolled-up mattress was standing by the door. Not a thin, government-issued one, a thick one, just like the one Seung-Woo himself had, a perk of his new status. Greg stopped singing through the bars. He looked at the mattress. He looked at Dae-Hyun. He said the spider now had a throne. Dae-Hyun didn't answer. He unfolded the mattress on the bunk. He lay down. For the first time in 5 days, his back didn't feel the metal bars. The 20th day. O'Brien's report had worked. Yoon was allowed to visit the cell 17 times a week, and Dae-Hyun was allowed to accompany her as an assistant. Formally, he was carrying a medical bag. In reality, O'Brien was simply turning a blind eye to the book Dae-Hyun had handed him that morning. They walked down the hallway of Block C, a quiet hallway, dim lighting, doors to solitary cells on both sides, silence behind most of them. Behind one, someone was tapping rhythmically on the wall. Behind another, quiet laughter. Cell 17. O'Brien unlocked the door with a key from a heavy bunch. The door was thicker than the others, steel, with an extra bolt. It was dark inside. A small window near the ceiling was barred and covered with dirty glass. A thin beam of gray light filtered through it. The cell was slightly larger than standard, 3 by 3. Bunk beds, a table, a chair, a stack of books on the table, pencil drawings on the wall, mountains, a river, a house with a tiled roof. The drawings were detailed and precise, the hand of a man who had been drawing the same thing for many years and had perfected it. An old man was sitting on the bunk. Seo Jong-Il, 72 years old, small, withered, like a tree that had stood in the wind for a long time and shed everything superfluous. All that remained were the trunk and the roots. His face was deeply wrinkled. His hair was completely white, short. His hands rested on his knees, calm, motionless. But his eyes were alive, black, sharp. The eyes of a man who sees more than he lets on. Yuna approached him. She sat down on a chair. She opened her bag. She began the examination. She took his blood pressure. She listened to his heart. The old man sat motionless. He let her do whatever was necessary, as if it were a familiar ritual. Dae-Hyun stood by the door. He said nothing. The old man didn't look at him, or perhaps he was pretending not to look. Yuna finished the examination. She recorded the readings. She said his blood pressure was slightly above normal, that he needed to cut back on salt in his diet. The old man didn't reply. Yuna packed up her bag. She looked at Dae-Hyun. She nodded toward the door. It was time to go. Dae-Hyun didn't move. He was looking at the old man. The old man finally looked up. He looked at him, for a long time, intently, as if reading the words written on his face. Then he said quietly, "You have your mother's eyes. That's bad news." Dae-Hyun felt something inside him tighten. His mother. He barely remembered her. She died when he was 4. His father never spoke of her. There were no photographs in the house. It was as if she'd been erased from the family history. But this old man knew her. He knew her eyes. Dae-Hyun asked why it was bad news. Seo Jong-Il didn't answer. He closed his eyes. He leaned back against the wall. The conversation was over. Yuna touched Dae-Hyun on the shoulder. They left. O'Brien locked the door. In the hallway, Yuna asked if he knew the old man. Dae-Hyun said no. Yuna looked at him. She didn't believe him, but she didn't argue. They walked to the infirmary in silence. At the door, Yuna stopped. She said the old man had been sitting there for 22 years, that in all that time, not a single visitor from the mainland had come to see him, not a single letter, not a single phone call. But every day he drew the same house on the wall, and she thinks that this house exists, or existed. Dae-Hyun listened. Yuna had never talked so much. Maybe because the day was gray and quiet. Maybe because cell 17 had a different effect on her than the other cells. She fell silent. She took his bag. She went to the infirmary. The door closed. Dae-Hyun stood in the hallway and thought about his mother. About eyes he didn't remember. About the old man who remembered them more than 20 years later. And about the house on the wall that they drew every day. Day 21. Tae-Seong brought the information. The man with the tattoo on his neck had been found. His name was Kim Tae-Hee, 32 years old, from the Korean bloc, but not one of Seung-Woo's people. One of the quiet types. One of those who kept to himself and didn't meddle in others' affairs. He'd been serving time for securities fraud. The tattoo on his neck turned out to be a letter, a Latin J. Tae-Seong said that Kim had received new shoes 3 days ago, through a night shift guard, that same young Asian man. Dae-Hyun pieced it all together. The young guard, Asian guard hands the inmate new shoes and a sharpened blade. The inmate attacks B447 in an empty hallway. The ghosts coordinate. The deputy warden provides cover. The uncle pays. A chain of events, long but clear. The question is what to do with it. Kill Kim. That's a decision anyone on the island. Simple, clear, final. Dae-Hyun rejected it. A dead Kim is a dead source of information. A living Kim is a thread leading to the ghosts, to the guard, to the deputy, to uncle. He decided to wait. But not just wait. He set up surveillance. Tae-Seong, with his one good hand, and 3 men Dae-Hyun had hired in exchange for cigarettes, watched Kim around the clock. Who he talks to, where he goes, who he passes notes to. Day 22. Dae-Hyun launched the second phase of his trading network. Until then, he'd worked as a middleman. He'd connect buyers with sellers and take a cut. That brought in 3 to 5 cigarettes a day, a steady but slow income. To scale up, he needed a system, a service bank. He started simple. Through Tae-Seong and 2 assistants, he announced that B447 was accepting deposits. Any inmate could deposit cigarettes, services, promises, anything of value. Dae-Hyun guaranteed their safety. After a week, the depositor would get their deposit back plus 10%. How did he do it? By putting the deposits back into circulation, investing them in deals, reaping the profits. The difference between the profit and the depositor's 10% was the bank's income. For the first 3 days, no one came. On the 4th day, 1 person came, an elderly Japanese man from Block D. He put down 5 cigarettes, silently, without asking any questions. He just put them down and left. Dae-Hyun counted them. He kept track in his head. Depositor number 1, 5 cigarettes. Term, 7 days. Return, 5.5. On the 5th day, 2 more people came. One put down 3 cigarettes. The second offered a service, laundry once a week. Dae-Hyun accepted. He converted the service into its cigarette equivalent, 2 cigarettes. That brought the total in circulation to 10 cigarettes. By the end of the week, he'd have to return 11. The average weekly profit from the trade was 25 cigarettes, minus 11 for returns, minus expenses for Tae-Seong and his assistants. Net profit, 8 to 10. The system worked. Small, fragile, but it worked. By the 25th day, the number of investors had grown to 9. The total volume of investments was 43 cigarettes and 7 services. Rumors were spreading. B447 keeps his word. B447 pays back with interest. B447 doesn't rip people off. His reputation grew, and with it, so did the attention. Che sent a message, through one of his men, a note on a scrap of paper left on Dae-Hyun's bunk in Block D. One sentence, "You don't have long left." Dae-Hyun read it. He folded the paper, put it in his pocket. He looked at Greg through the bars. Greg was smiling. He'd seen the note. He'd seen Dae-Hyun read it. He'd seen everything. Dae-Hyun asked Greg which way the man who left the note had gone. Greg said to the right, toward the stairs. Dae-Hyun nodded. Greg asked when Dae-Hyun would pay him for the information. Dae-Hyun asked what Greg wanted. Greg said he wanted a story, every night, before bed. Any story, just someone talking. Because in solitary, silence kills faster than a razor blade. Dae-Hyun looked at him. Greg wasn't smiling. For the first time. His eyes were empty. Not cheerfully empty as usual, just empty. Like a room with all the furniture cleared out. Dae-Hyun said, "All right." A story every night. Greg nodded. He lay down on the bunk, turned toward the wall. That night, Dae-Hyun told him about Wharton, about how, as a freshman, he went into the wrong lecture hall and spent 2 hours listening to a lecture on medieval history before realizing he'd made a much, and that it was the best lecture of the entire semester. Greg listened in silence. When Dae-Hyun finished, Greg said it was a bad story. But Dae-Hyun has a good voice. Let him tell more. Day 26. Dae-Hyun was walking to the cafeteria when he saw an Asian security guard. The same one. Young one, with precise movements. The guard was standing at the entrance to the administration building. He was talking to someone inside. Dae-Hyun slowed his pace. He didn't stop. He just slowed down. He looked. The guard's name tag read Park. Day 28, the second meeting with Seo Jong-Il. Yuna was conducting the inspection. Dae-Hyun stood by the door. The old man was sitting on the bunk. The same house was painted on the wall, the same mountains, the same river. But Dae-Hyun noticed something new. A small object lay on the table next to the books. A pebble, smooth, gray. A sea pebble, polished by hand until it shone. The old man had been fingering it during the examination. Yuna checked his blood pressure. She said it was better than last time. She wrote it down. She gathered her bag. She looked at Dae-Hyun. She nodded. It was time to go. Dae-Hyun didn't move. He looked at the old man and said that his father, Cho Gyeong-Ho, was dying of pancreatic cancer, that he had about 30 days left, that Dae-Hyun was here because his uncle had framed him and sent him to the island, and that Dae-Hyun knew that Seo Jong-Il had been his father's friend. The old man stopped sorting through the pebbles. His fingers froze. He looked at Dae-Hyun for a long time, in silence. Then he said that Kyung-Sok wasn't his friend. Kyung-Sok was his brother, not by blood, by choice. Together, they had built the first shipyard in Ulsan 40 years ago, back when Kyungsung Group was just a shed with a single welding machine. Dae-Hyun felt something shift inside him. The shipyard in Ulsan. His father had told him about it, but he'd never mentioned his partner. He'd never said the name Seo Jong-Il, as if he'd cut that man out of history just as he'd cut his mother out. He asked why the old man was there. Seo Jong-Il looked out the window at the gray patch of sky beyond the bars and said he knew too much about the 12 families, about their deals, about their skeletons in the closet. He was the financial architect not only of the Kyungsung Group, he had devised schemes for half of Korea's chaebols. And when one of those schemes collapsed and 3 families lost money, a scapegoat was needed. Kyung-Suk could have protected him, but he didn't, because protecting one meant starting a war with 3. And Kyung-sok chose the conglomerate. He chose the empire. He chose money. The old man fell silent. His face was calm, without anger, without bitterness. 22 years on the island had stripped away everything superfluous. Only silence remained. Tae-Hyun asked why the old man wasn't angry. Seo Jong-Il smiled, subtly, barely noticeably. He said that anger is an investment with a negative return. He prefers to paint a house. Yuna stood in the doorway and listened. Her face was impassive, but her eyes were shining. Tae-Hyun noticed. She knew part of this story. The old man had apparently told her before, bit by bit, over the years of medical checkups. He asked the old man if he knew why his father had sent him here. Seo Jong-il looked at him, straight on, without flinching. He said he knew, but he wouldn't say, because Tae-Hyun had to figure it out for himself. If the old man told him, it would be someone else's knowledge, and someone else's knowledge doesn't save you. Only your own does. Tae-Hyun wanted to insist. He wanted to pressure him. But he looked into the old man's eyes and realized that pressure wouldn't work here. This man had lived in a 3x3 cell for 22 years. Pressure was as abstract to him as a stock price. He nodded. He said he'd come back. So, Jong-il didn't answer. He went back to sorting through the cells. They stepped out. In the hallway, Yuna said quietly that Dae-Hyun was the first person the old man had told about the shipyard to in 22 years. Dae-Hyun said nothing, but inside, he felt the pieces falling into place. His father, the shipyard, an old friend's betrayal, the island, his uncle, the inheritance. It was all connected, and the thread led to a question that still had no answer. Why hadn't his father stopped his uncle? On the 30th day, what Dae-Hyun had been waiting for happened. Choi moved to open conflict. That morning at the quarry, 4 of Choi's men surrounded 3 men from the Korean work detail who were working on the new schedule, the schedule that had become possible after the deal with Sullivan. The 4 took the pickaxes from the 3 men. They beat them up. Not severely, just to make a point. They broke one man's nose. They knocked out a tooth from the second. The third managed to escape. The message was clear. Cho does not accept the new order. Cho will keep striking until the old order is restored. Dae-Hyun found out an hour later. He went to see Seung-Woo. Seung-Woo was angry, quietly angry, dangerously angry. He wanted to retaliate, round up some people, go to Che, settle it by force. Dae-Hyun said no. Seung-Woo gave him a heavy look. Dae-Hyun said that open conflict with Che was exactly what his uncle wanted. Chaos on the island. Blood. Chaos. Amid the chaos, the ghosts would get to Dae-Hyun, and it would all be over. Che might not even know he's being used. He's simply reacting to a threat to his territory. A natural reaction. Predictable. We mustn't strike Che. We need to make Che want to cooperate. Seung-Woo asked how. Dae-Hyun said Che has a weakness. His men are sick. There's dust at the quarry. Stone dust clogs their lungs. Half of Che's men cough at night. In a year, they'll have silicosis. In 3 years, half of them won't be able to work. Che knows this, and there's nothing he can do about it. The medical unit treats the symptoms, but not the cause. And the cause is simple. There are no protective masks. There's no rotation schedule. There are no breaks to clear their lungs. Dae-Hyun can organize all of this. Through Yoon, through a medical request, through the rules of the international organization that funds the medical unit. If done correctly, the administration is obligated to provide protective measures, free of charge, according to protocol. Dae-Hyun can do this for Che's people, free of charge, no strings attached, except for one. A truce. The Korean unit and Unit B would split the quarry fairly. No kickbacks, no beatings, no 2-packs a week. Seung-Woo thought. Min-Jae listened from the doorway. For the first time, his expression was neither contempt nor distrust. Interest. Cautious, but interest. Seung-Woo said, "Okay, let Dae-Hyun give it a try." Dae-Hyun went to see Che, not through a middleman, in person. He entered Block B's territory, alone, without security. Che's men surrounded him instantly, 4 of them, the very same ones who had beaten up the Koreans that morning. Dae-Hyun stopped. He looked at them, calmly. He said he wanted to speak with Che. They looked at each other. One of them walked away. He returned 5 minutes later. He nodded. Che was sitting in his cell. It was larger than a standard cell, almost twice as big. It had a real table, 2 chairs, and a curtain on the window. A little kingdom. Choi was sitting at the table, eating. Real food, not prison gruel. Rice with meat, vegetables, even sauce, smuggled in from the kitchen. He didn't offer Dae-Hyun a seat. Dae-Hyun sat down on his own. Choi stopped eating. He looked at him. Small eyes, a heavy gaze. He asked why B447 had come to his house. Dae-Hyun spoke for 4 minutes, without pauses, without unnecessary words, numbers, facts, projections. How many of Choi's workers were coughing? What percentage would develop silicosis in a year? How many of them would stop working? What that meant for the quarries, for Choi's budget, for his power. Then a proposal. Masks, rotation, decontamination, all through the medical unit, free of charge, in exchange for a truce. Choi listened. He didn't interrupt. When Dae-Hyun finished, Choi finished his rice. He wiped his mouth. He looked at Dae-Hyun and said he knew who he was, that he knew how much his head was worth, that he could take that $500,000 right now. Dae-Hyun said he could, but then, in a year, half his men would be coughing up blood, and 500,000 cigarettes won't buy new lungs. Cho was silent. 5 seconds. 10. Then he smirked, briefly, without any joy. He said that Dae-Hyun was either the smartest man on the island or the dumbest, and that in a week, he'd find out which was true. Dae-Hyun understood. A week. Choi is giving him a week. If there are masks and a rotation, there will be a truce. If not, there will be war. He walked out of Block B. His legs felt like cotton. His hands were shaking. His body craved rest. His mind was shutting down. He made it to his cell in Block D and collapsed onto the mattress. He threw up. Bile. An empty stomach. Greg watched through the bars and said nothing. Then he said quietly that Dae-Hyun had a nosebleed. Dae-Hyun raised his hand to his face. Blood. Warm. Dark. It was flowing from his right nostril. He lay on his side. He waited for it to stop. 10 minutes. The bleeding stopped. He wiped his face with the sleeve of his prison uniform. He closed his eyes. The price. The brain pays with the body. Every time he goes all out, his body breaks down a little more. If this continues, in a month, he won't be able to walk. On the 32nd day, Yuna filed a request for protective measures for the quarries. An official one, with seals, with references to the protocols of an international organization. The administration received the request that morning. By evening, a reply had arrived. The request was approved. The masks would arrive in 5 days. The rotation would begin immediately. Yuna handed Dae-Hyun a copy of the reply. He looked at the paper, at the administration's seal, at the signature. The signature wasn't the warden's. It was the deputy warden's, the very same one who worked for his uncle. The deputy had approved the request. Why? because refusing it would have meant violating the protocol of an international organization. And a violation of protocol means an inspection. An inspection means outside attention. Outside attention is the last thing people who run a prison that officially doesn't exist need. Dae-Hyun used the system against the system. On the 35th day, Dae-Hyun opened the bank officially, not in his cell, not through whispers and notes, in the dining hall, in front of everyone. He stood on a bench, not on a table. Those who want to show themselves as superior to others climb onto a table. Those who simply want to be seen climb onto a bench. The difference is small, but on the island, small differences kill and save. 400 people were watching him. The Korean bloc, the American bloc, the Russian bloc, Bloc B, Bloc D, ghosts among them, guards by the walls, everyone. His right arm was bandaged, his ribs were wrapped, his eye had healed, but the scar on his cheekbone remained. He looked like a man the island had chewed up for 5 weeks, and yet he was still standing. He spoke in an even voice, no shouting, no strain, just like at a presentation, as if behind him were a screen with charts rather than a concrete wall with patches of mold. He said that everyone here lives as if every day were their last, that he proposes living as if there were a tomorrow, that he's opening a bank, not for money, for services. You deposit and he guarantees a return. You owe and he guarantees protection of your debt. He has no authority here. He has only his word. And if anyone thinks his word is worthless, let them stand up now and he'll give away everything he has. Silence. 400 people. No one stood up. Not because they were afraid. There was nothing to be afraid of. The man on the bench with his bandaged arm didn't inspire physical fear. They didn't stand up because they didn't want to. They wanted someone to speak a word about tomorrow on an island where tomorrow was an abstraction, where every day could be their last. Not because of some grand rhetoric, but because of a knife in the hallway or poison in their porridge. They wanted someone to promise that their contribution would pay off, that their labor would be worth more than nothing, that the system might not be solely against them. Dae-Hyun got from the bench. He sat down in his seat. He finished his porridge. Min-Jae stood by the wall and watched him. For the first time in 5 weeks, the old man didn't look hostile. Not friendly, but pensive. Something in his eyes had shifted. A small crack in the wall that had stood for 11 years. After lunch, 12 people approached Dae-Hyun from 4 different blocks. They all wanted to open an account. By evening, there were 41 account holders. The total amount was 320 cigarettes and 22 services. Dae-Hyun appointed Tae-Seong as manager. He made 3 assistants cashiers. He organized the record keeping. Each investor was assigned a number. Every transaction was recorded, not on paper, but in their heads. 4 minds remembered everything. If one were killed, the other 3 would still remember. Data backup. On the 36th day, Seung-Woo came into the cafeteria and asked Dae-Hyun in front of everyone what a return on investment was. Dae-Hyun explained, simply, without jargon. You invest 10, you get 12 back. The 2 is the return. 20% is the rate. The higher the rate, the greater the risk. The lower the rate, the more reliable the investment. Seung-Woo listened. Then he pulled a pencil stub out of his pocket and began drawing on the table. Lines, numbers, a graph. Crooked and uneven, but a graph nonetheless. Dae-Hyun looked at it. Seung-Woo had drawn the x-axis and the y-axis. No labels, but correctly. Min-Jae stood nearby and looked at the graph. His face was stony, but he watched and he didn't leave. 2 months ago, he had wanted to kill this rookie. Now he stood there watching as the rookie taught the unit leader how to draw graphs. The world was changing. Slowly, but it was changing. On the 38th day, Dae-Hyun came to the medical unit in the morning, not on schedule. Yuna was alone. She was sorting through the supplies, counting bandages. She was running out. The shipment was delayed. Dae-Hyun sat down on a stretcher. He asked how she was doing. Yuna looked at him. Such a simple question. How are you? On the island, no one ever asked that. Not because they didn't want to, because the answer might be something better left unknown. She said she was fine. Dae-Hyun said she hadn't eaten lunch yesterday. He'd seen it. Yuna froze. He asked if she'd eaten that morning. Yuna didn't answer. Dae-Hyun nodded. He stood up. He left. 2 hours later, someone placed a container of warm rice soup in Yuna's locker in the medical ward's changing room. No note, no name, just soup. Yuna opened the container. Steam rose from it. The smell of rice broth. Simple. Homemade. She stood there with the container in her hands, staring at it. 30 seconds. Then she sat down on a bench. She picked up the spoon lying nearby and began to eat, slowly, like someone who had forgotten the taste of a hot meal. She didn't know who had brought it, but she had a hunch, because only one person on the island had noticed that she wasn't eating. Dae-Hyun arranged it through boardroom in the kitchen, every day, a container in the locker, anonymously, no strings attached, no expectation of gratitude. Because gratitude is pressure, and pressure on a person who punishes themselves leads to even greater punishment. There was no need to put pressure on her. It was enough just to be there, like infrastructure, like the warmth that comes from a radiator. You don't thank the radiator, you just don't freeze. On the 39th day, a crisis struck. One of the bank's investors demanded an early repayment, immediately, all 15 cigarettes, right now. His name was Wang, a Chinese man, 40 years old, nervous, depositor number 9. Dae-Hyun asked why he needed an early withdrawal. Wang said he had to pay off a debt, right now, because the people he owed money to would come for him that night. Dae-Hyun looked at him. Wang was trembling. His face was ashen. His eyes darted around. Fear. Real. Not an act. The problem was that Wang's 15 cigarettes were in circulation. 3 went toward the deal with the laundry, 5 toward the contract with the kitchen, 7 in ongoing operations. Returning 15 right now meant pulling them out of circulation. And pulling them out of circulation meant scuppering 3 deals. Scuppered deals mean a loss of trust. A loss of trust means the bank's demise. But not returning them means that Van will take a hit tonight that he might not survive. And the whole island will see that Bank B447 doesn't protect its depositors. Which also means the bank's demise. 2 options, both bad. Dae-Hyun closed his eyes. 3 seconds. His brain kicked in, hard, like an engine has been revved to full throttle. A third option. Don't return the cigarettes to Wang. Pay off his debt directly. If Wang's debt is paid off, he doesn't need the cigarettes. If he doesn't need the cigarettes, the cash flow isn't disrupted. The question is who Wang owes. Wang said, 2 guys from the Russian bloc, 15 cigarettes for a card debt. Dae-Hyun remembered. The Russian bloc, cards, Kozlov's moonshine. Kozlov distills moonshine and sells it to the Russian bloc. Kozlov works with Dae-Hyun through Bahram Salt. Kozlov owes Dae-Hyun a favor for 3 months of supplies. Dae-Hyun went to see Kozlov. He explained the situation. He asked Kozlov to talk to the 2 guys from the Russian bloc. He said that Wang's debt was being transferred to Dae-Hyun, that Dae-Hyun would settle it within 3 days, not with cigarettes, but with a favor. He would decide exactly what kind of favor with them personally. Kozlov looked at him, a heavy, calm gaze. He said that the Russians don't like it when the terms are changed. Dae-Hyun said that the Russians love moonshine, and that Kozlov's next shipment would be 20% larger than usual. at Dae-Hyun's expense, because Dae-Hyun would increase the salt supply. Kozlov thought for a moment. He nodded. He said he'd talk it over. That evening, Kozlov returned. He said the Russians had agreed. Won's debt would be transferred to B447, 3 days, as a favor. Dae-Hyun went to see Won. He said his debt was settled. Won looked at him. He didn't believe it. Then he did. His hands stopped shaking. He said thank you, quietly, almost in a whisper, like a man who'd just been pulled from under the wheels of a car. Dae-Hyun nodded. He left. And as he walked back to his cell, he thought about what had just happened. The bank had weathered its first liquidity crisis. It hadn't collapsed. It hadn't lost any depositors. It hadn't lost trust. And the decision wasn't a financial one. The decision was a human one. He had paid off someone else's debt because Wong was a real person with a real fear, not an abstract depositor, not a line in a report. Day 42, night. Dae-Hyun lay on his bunk and listened to the silence. Greg was asleep, or pretending to be. The hallway of Block D was quiet. Too quiet. Usually at night, someone was snoring. Someone was muttering. Someone was tossing and turning on the creaking bunks. Now, nothing. A silence that sounded like a taut string. He opened his eyes. Darkness. The light wasn't on. He listened. Footsteps. Quiet. Soft. Not guards' boots. Bare feet or socks. Several pairs. 3. Maybe 4. They were heading toward his cell. Dae-Hyun stood up, quietly, without making the bunk creak. He pressed himself against the wall to the right of the door. If they came in, the first blow would land on the bunk, right where he was supposed to be lying. He'd have 3 seconds to react before the attackers realized the bunk was empty. The door opened, silently. The hinges were well oiled, just like that first night. But these weren't the 3 guys from the Korean block who'd come to check on the new guy. These were the ghosts. The first one entered quickly. He darted toward the bunk, a knife thrust into the mattress, right where the chest should have been. The mattress burst open. The stuffing flew out. The second one followed. He stood by the door, blocking the exit. The third remained in the hallway, keeping watch. A classic trio, just like back then. Only on that first night, they'd beaten him with their fists. Now there was a knife. The first one realized the bunks were empty. He turned around, quickly, professionally. But Dae-Hyun was already screaming. Not words, a sound. A clear, loud scream that echoed through the entire corridor of Block D. Greg, behind bars, woke up instantly. And he screamed too. Louder, more terrifying. The scream of a maniac at 4 a.m. A sound that made your hair stand on end. The corridor came alive. Cell doors, voices, noise. The lights in the hallway turned on automatically, a motion sensor. The ghosts were now in the light. 3 of them, their faces hidden, dark clothing. The first one with a knife. The second with something resembling a noose. The third unarmed. The coordinator. The light and noise were not their allies. They operated in darkness and silence. The coordinator gave a signal. Retreat. The 3 darted toward the exit from the block, quickly, in unison. They vanished around the corner before the first guard reached the hallway. Dae-Hyun stood against the wall. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. His hands were shaking. His legs were shaking. His whole body was shaking. He sank to the floor, sat down. He leaned against the wall. He closed his eyes. 3 seconds. If only he hadn't woken up. If only he hadn't heard the footsteps. If only he'd been lying on his bunk. The knife would have pierced his heart right through. Greg was looking at him through the bars. His eyes glinted in the light of the lamp. He said he screamed beautifully. Dae-Hyun didn't answer. The trembling wouldn't stop. 20 minutes, until Seung-Woo arrived. Seung-Woo looked at the slashed mattress, at the hole left by the knife, at Dae-Hyun on the floor. He sat down next to him. He didn't say anything. He just sat there. 5 minutes, until the trembling subsided. Then he helped him up. In the morning, Dae-Hyun gathered information. Tae-Seong and 3 observers questioned Block D. No one had seen anything. Of course, but Greg had seen it. Greg always saw everything. Greg said there was a third person, the co-adder, the one without a weapon. He was missing his left pinky. Dae-Hyun remembered. The man without a left pinky. The ghost's coordinator. He started searching. 2 days later, he found him. Not the man without a pinky. His contact. Kim Tae-hee. The one with the J tattoo on his neck. Dae-Hyun's observers saw Kim talking to a man near the administration building. The man turned around and Tae-Seong saw his left hand. No pinky finger. The man walked into the administration building. Unhindered. No check. Like one of their own. So he worked there. So he's not an inmate, a guard, or an administrative staff member. The man without a pinky finger worked in administration and coordinated the ghosts. The connection led to the deputy warden. A direct line from Uncle, through the deputy, through the coordinator, through Kim, to the knife in the mattress. Dae-Hyun thought about it for 2 days. How to use this information. Take out the coordinator. No, he's in administration. He's off limits to the inmates. Take out Kim. No, a dead Kim is a severed thread. A living Kim is a channel. Use Kim. Yes. If he could turn Kim, Dae-Hyun would have eyes and ears inside the ghost's network. On the 44th day, he found Kim at the quarry. He walked over. He sat down next to him. Kim tensed up. His hand twitched toward the top of his boot. There was a sharp object there. Dae-Hyun said calmly that he wasn't going to touch him, that he wanted to talk. Kim looked around. No one was nearby. Dae-Hyun said he knew everything. About the boots, about the sharp object in the hallway, about security guard Park, about the coordinator without a pinky finger, about the money Kim received for the contract. Kim turned pale. Dae-Hyun continued. He said Kim had 2 options. First, Dae-Hyun passes this information on to Seung-Woo. Seung-Woo passes it on to the Korean unit. The Korean unit finds Kim that night. Second, Kim starts working for Dae-Hyun. He passes on information about the ghosts, about their plans, about his contacts with the coordinator. In return, Dae-Hyun guarantees his safety, through Seung-Woo, through the bank, through a network that now covers half the island. Kim remained silent. His hands were shaking, not from the cold. Dae-Hyun added a third point. He said he knew why Kim was here. Securities fraud. A 3-year sentence. But there are no sentences on the island. Here, you stay until they decide otherwise, or until you die. Dae-Hyun plans to get out of here, and when he does, he'll take with him those he calls his own. Kim could become one of them, or he might stay here, with the ghosts, who use him as expendable material and will discard him when he's no longer needed. Kim looked at him. Dae-Hyun saw the calculation taking place in his eyes. Fear versus hope. Habit versus opportunity. Kim said quietly that the coordinator's name is Lim, that he's the assistant to the deputy chief, that there are 6 ghosts, 2 from the Korean bloc, 1 from the American bloc, 1 from the Russian bloc, 2 from Block D, that the next attack is planned for the 48th day, during the guard shift change, when the blocks are empty. Dae-Hyun nodded. Information. 4 days. He stood up, patted Kim on the shoulder, left. On his way to the cafeteria, he stopped at a window in the hallway. He looked out at the sea. Gray. Endless. Somewhere beyond the horizon lay Seoul. His father in the hospital room, his uncle in his office, the world where he had been a vice president with a degree and a $3,000 suit. Now he stood in a robe with someone else's blood on his sleeve, planning how to survive the next 4 days. And he knew for sure that he would survive, because now he had something he didn't have on the first day: people. Sun-Woo, who sat silently beside him while the tremors subsided. Tae-Seong, who worked with one hand and didn't complain. Kwon from the laundry room, who could now see a little better because Dae-Hyun had gotten him some eye drops through Yoon. Kozlov, who distilled moonshine and relayed messages to the Russians. Ba-Ram, who put soup in the nurse's locker every day. Greg, who screamed in the dark to save his neighbor. Even Min-Jae, who still didn't trust anyone but no longer wanted to kill. 12 threads, 12 people, a network that kept him afloat. He went to the dining hall, sat down, picked up a spoon, began to eat. The porridge was bland as always, but warm. On an island where everything is cold and wet, warm porridge is almost a luxury. He ate and thought about the 48th day, about the ghosts, about Lima without a pinky finger, about the uncle who sat in Seoul signing papers, about the 20 days that remained, and about the fact that on the 48th day, he wouldn't be a victim. He would be the one setting the trap. Day 45, 3 days before the ghost's attack. Dae-Hyun sat in his cell in Block D and drew up a plan, not in his head, for the first time, on paper. With the stub of a pencil on the back of the medical form Yuna had given him to record his blood pressure readings. Kim had said the attack would take place during the shift change, between 6 and 6:30 in the evening, 30 minutes when the day shift was leaving and the night shift hadn't taken over yet. 30 minutes when the blocks were empty because everyone was in the dining hall for dinner. The ghosts were counting on Dae-Hyun being in his cell. They figured he'd skip dinner, as he sometimes did when his mind shut down after a hard day and his body demanded rest. They'd studied his habits. They knew when he was at his weakest. They knew the schedule. Professionals. His uncle hadn't skimped on anything. Dae-Hyun had 3 options. First, not to be in his cell, to go out for dinner. The ghosts would come to an empty cell. They'd leave. The attack would fail. But that would only be a delay. They'd try again, and again, until they succeeded. Option 2, stay in the cell. With Seung-Woo's men, face the ghosts. A fight, blood, casualties on both sides, possibly his own, possibly his death. Option 3, stay in the cell, alone, but not alone. He chose the third option. On the 46th day, he met with Doc Riley, at the quarry, on that same rock in the shade of the awning. Doc's lenses hadn't arrived yet, but the information about the corrupt guard was already in play. Doc had taken over the medical supply chain and was now treating his people for half the previous price. His influence in the American bloc had grown. He was grateful, not with words. He just listened when Dae-Hyun spoke. Dae-Hyun said that in 2 days, the ghosts would try to kill him, that there were 4 ghosts. One of them was from the American bloc. Dae-Hyun gave a name. Doc took off his glasses. He wiped them, put them back on. He looked at Dae-Hyun. He asked how he knew. Dae-Hyun said he had a source on the inside. Doc asked what Dae-Hyun wanted. Dae-Hyun said he wanted Doc to talk to his man, the one from the American bloc who was in the ghosts. He didn't threaten him. He didn't hit him. He just told him one thing, that Doc knew, and that if that man went out on the 48 days mission, upon his return, it wouldn't be a bed waiting for him, but something else. Doc knew how to do something else better than anyone on the island. A former military doctor who knew how to kill in a way that made it look like a heart attack. One warning would be enough. Doc nodded. No questions, no haggling. The partnership worked. On the 47th day, Dae-Hyun met with Kozlov. Kozlov was sitting in his workshop, fixing a pipe, his hands covered in rust. Dae-Hyun said that one of the ghosts was from the Russian bloc and gave a description. Kozlov said he knew this man. Short, mean, and a recent arrival. He speaks with a southern accent, not a real Russian, Ukrainian or Moldovan. Dae-Hyun said he wanted Kozlov to pass the information on to the Russian bloc, that this man works for an outside client, that he takes money from outside sources, that he is disloyal to the bloc. In the Russian bloc, disloyalty was punished quickly and simply. Kozlov looked at Dae-Hyun. He asked if it was true. Dae-Hyun said yes. Kozlov said he'd pass it on. On the evening of the 47th day, Kim sent an update. The ghost from the American unit had backed out of the mission. He said he'd fallen ill. The ghost from the Russian bloc had vanished. The Russian bloc had dealt with him in its own way. Of the 6 ghosts, 4 remained, minus Coordinator Lim, who didn't go on missions himself, minus 1 more who was on duty at the bloc's exit. That left 2 for the direct attack. There were 4, now there were 2. Dae-Hyun had cut the threat in half without raising a fist. On the 48th day, at 6 o'clock in the evening, Dae-Hyun was lying on the bunk in a cell in Block D, alone. Greg remained silent through the bars. He knew what was coming. Dae-Hyun had warned him that morning. He'd said that if there was any noise at night, Greg had better lie still. Greg said he'd lie still, but if anyone needed to scream, he could scream better than anyone else on the island. Dae-Hyun waited. 6:10, 6:15, 6:18. Footsteps, 2 people, quick, soft. They approached the door. The door opened. The first one entered with a knife. The second followed. Dae-Hyun was lying on the bunk. He didn't move. The first one stepped toward the bunk. He swung the knife. And at that moment, a voice rang out from the hallway. Steady. Calm. Park Seung-Woo's voice. Seung-Woo said one word. Stop. The first man froze. He turned around. 7 men were standing in the hallway. Seung-Woo, Min-Jae, and 5 others from the Korean wing. Quiet. Calm. Ready. They hadn't come through the main entrance of Block D. They'd come through the laundry room's back room, which connected to Block D via a service corridor. The corridor that Dae-Hyun had found on the 3rd day, when he'd memorized every turn and every door. 2 ghosts were trapped. A camera behind them, 7 in front. Dae-Hyun sat down on the bunk. He looked at the 2 of them. Their faces were hidden. They wore dark clothing. The first one had a knife. The second had a rope. A noose. Dae-Hyun said quietly that they had a choice. Put down their weapons and talk. Or don't put them down and talk to Seung-Woo. The first one looked at the 7 in the hallway. He looked at the knife in his hand. He put the knife on the floor. The second one put down the rope. Min-Jae entered the cell. He took the weapon. He led both of them out into the hallway. Seung-Woo nodded to Dae-Hyun. He left. He took the men and the 2 ghosts with him. Dae-Hyun stayed in the cell. He lay back down on the bunk. His hands were shaking. His whole body was shaking. But not as badly as last time. He was getting used to it. Greg said through the bars that it was a nice trap, a clean job. Dae-Hyun didn't answer. He closed his eyes. He thought about how Min-Jae had come. Min-Jae, who didn't trust him, who wanted to kill him, who was waiting for Dae-Hyun to make a mistake. He came. He stood in the hallway with the others. He took his weapon. He led the ghosts out. Not because Seung-Woo ordered him to. Seung-Woo didn't order Min-Jae. No one ordered Min-Jae. Min-Jae came because he decided to come. On his own. Something had changed in the old man. Maybe when Dae-Hyun mentioned his daughter's name. Maybe when the bank weathered the crisis. Maybe when Che agreed to a truce. Maybe all of those things together. Little things. The 50th day. 10 days until his father's death. Dae-Hyun stood by the window in the hallway of Block C and looked out at the sea. Gray as always. Endless. Beyond it lay a world that continued to exist without him. Meetings he didn't attend, documents his uncle signed, an empire slowly passing into the hands of others. He was counting. In 50 days, he had transformed himself from prey into the island's central hub. The service bank was operating steadily, 63 depositors from all blocks, a turnover of 520 cigarettes and 41 services. The truce with Che was holding. Neutrality with Doc was secure. Kozlov was conducting operations with the Russian bloc. Min-Jae no longer wanted to kill him. The ghosts were weakened. Seo Jong-Il spoke with him every week. Yuna left soup for him in his locker. All of this was good, but it wasn't enough. Because all of this was on the island, and the war was raging on the mainland. He needed a line of communication with the outside world. The satellite phone in the deputy's office was an option, but a risky one. The office was in the administrative building, under security, cameras, coordinator Lim. One wrong move and he'd be sent to solitary confinement. Or worse. He thought about it for 3 days. On the 52nd day, he found another way. Yuna. She wasn't a prisoner. She was an employee of an international medical organization. Her contract included the right to communicate with the mainland, a work phone, email via a satellite modem in the medical wing, limited access, only for work-related correspondence. But it was access. He went to the medical ward in the morning. Yuna was dressing the wound of an elderly Filipino man. Dae-Hyun waited. When the Filipino man left, Dae-Hyun closed the door. Yuna looked at him. She raised an eyebrow. Dae-Hyun sat down on a wheelchair. He said he needed her help, not medical help. Yuna folded her arms. She waited. He told her everything, who he really was. The heir to the Kyongsung group, his uncle's setup, Hojuk Thalti, 60 days, the inheritance. Accountant Lee Jae-Hoon, who can confirm the setup. He spoke for 10 minutes. Exactly. Without emotion. Like a report. Yuna listened. Her face was impassive. Professional. When he finished, she was silent for 30 seconds. Then she asked why she should believe him. Dae-Hyun said she didn't have to, that he wasn't asking her to believe him. He was asking her to check. The name Cho Dae-Hyun, Kyongsung Group, public information. If she found confirmation through her work computer, she could decide for herself. Yuna looked at him for a long time. Then she said she'd check, but if he was lying, she wouldn't let him into the medical ward anymore. Ever. Dae-Hyun said, "All right." He left. He waited 2 days. On the 54th, she found him at the quarry. She approached with her medical bag. As usual. But there was something different on her face. Not an expression, a lack of expression. Too meticulous, too controlled. She checked, and she found it. She said quietly that she'd found an article in the Korea Herald from 3 months ago about the arrest of the heir to the Kyongsung Group on charges of money laundering. The trial took place in absentia. The defendant was found guilty. The sentence wasn't published. The convict's whereabouts are unknown. The article was written by a journalist named Emily Zhang. Dae-Hyun heard the name, Emily Zhang, a journalist for the Korea Herald, the one who brought down 2 chaebols. She was already digging. She'd already found a discrepancy. She'd already written the story. He asked Yuna if she could send a letter through her work email. Yuna looked at him. He said he understood what she was risking, that if the administration found out, her contract would be terminated, and she'd end up on the mainland without a job. He added that he had no right to ask. Yuna said he was right. He didn't. Then she paused. She said she'd send 1 letter, just one, a short one, no details. The sender's address would be her work email. If the journalist replied, Yuna would pass on the response. If not, that would be the end of it. Dae-Hyun dictated the text, short, 3 sentences, addressed to Emily Zhang at the Korea Herald. B447 is alive. Lee Jae-Hoon knows the truth. Find him before others do. No signature, no name. Yuna memorized it. She left. Dae-Hyun stood at the quarry and watched her go, a small figure in a white lab coat amid the gray stone and gray sky. She risked everything. Her contract, her safety, the only place she had chosen as her punishment. And she didn't risk it for his sake. She did it for the truth. Because somewhere beneath the armor of professionalism and guilt was a woman who believed that the truth matters. He thought that when it was all over, the first thing he would do was find her a job at a normal hospital. Not on an island, not in hell. In a place where patients recover, where you can buy hot soup in the cafeteria instead of waiting for an anonymous container in a locker. The third meeting with Seo Jong-Il, day 55. Yuna was conducting the examination. Dae-Hyun stood by the door. The old man sat on the bunk, a pebble in his hands, a house on the wall. The same mountains, the same river. When Yuna finished and left, Dae-Hyun stayed behind. Seo Jong-il looked at him. Dae-Hyun said that in 5 days his father would die, that he wouldn't have time to get out, that the inheritance would go to his uncle, that everything he'd done on the island might turn out to be meaningless. The old man was silent. Then he asked why Dae-Hyun had come to the island. Dae-Hyun said he'd been brought there against his will. The old man shook his head. He said that wasn't right. He asked why Dae-Hyun had stayed on the island, why he hadn't broken down. Day 58. A reply from Emily Zhang arrived via Yoon. It was brief, just 4 sentences. Lee Jae-Hoon had been found. He's in hiding in Taiwan. The documents have been gathered. We need testimony from the island, evidence of the frame-up, names, dates, schemes. Dae-Hyun read it, reread it, a 3rd time. Emily Zhang worked quickly. In 3 days, she found the accountant his uncle had tried to eliminate. Dae-Hyun sat down in his cell and began to write. On the backs of the medical forms that Yuna had been collecting for him for a week, in small handwriting, everything he knew. The date of his arrest, the names of the officers who participated in the frame-up, the account numbers he remembered, the scheme of fictitious transactions, the Hojuk Palte procedure and who signed it, the name of the judge who presided over the case in absentia, the name of the deputy warden and his connection to his uncle, a description of Blackstone Isle, the island's coordinates, the number of prisoners, the conditions of detention. 12 pages, in small handwriting, 6 hours of work. Her hand ached, her head was buzzing, but every line was a nail in the lid of her uncle's coffin. He handed the pages to Yuna on the morning of the 59th day. Yuna took them. She looked at the thickness of the stack. She looked at Dae-Hyun. She said it was more than just a letter. Dae-Hyun said he knew, that he understood the risk, that if she didn't want to, he'd find another way. Yuna was silent for a moment. Then she said she'd scan the pages using a medical scanner, attach them to the email as an attachment, send them, and then delete everything from her computer. Dae-Hyun nodded. Yuna put the pages away in her medical bag. She looked at him. For the first time in 2 months, there was something on her face other than a professional mask. Not a smile, not nervousness. Determination, calm and firm, like that of a surgeon entering the operating room, knowing the surgery will be a long one. She left. Dae-Hyun stood in the hallway and breathed, deeply, slowly, through ribs that had almost healed, through lungs that had grown accustomed to stone dust, through a body that in 59 days had lost 7 kilograms and was now covered in scars he hadn't had 2 months ago. He had done everything he could. The rest depended on Emily, on Jae-Hoon in Taiwan, on a system that might work or might not. The 60th day. Dae-Hyun woke up at 4 in the morning, just like on the first day. There was no rain. It was quiet. A gray sky, a gray sea, a gray island. He lay on the cot and thought of his father. The old man was dying. Maybe he was already dead. Maybe at this very moment, in a private clinic room in Gangnam, tubes, monitors, IVs. His uncle by the bed. Or not by the bed. Maybe his uncle was already at the office, signing documents, claiming his inheritance. 57 billion. Controlling stakes. 200,000 employees. Everything is passing to the man who betrayed both his brother and his nephew. Dae-Hyun clenched the pebble in his pocket. Smooth, warm. His mother's pebble. 30 years ago, on a beach in Busan. He closed his eyes. He didn't cry. He couldn't. He didn't know how. He'd forgotten how somewhere between the first beating and the 50th day, tears were a luxury he couldn't afford. Instead, he stood up, washed his face, went out into the hallway, walked to the dining hall, sat down, took a tray. Porridge, bread, water. He ate in silence. Seung-Woo sat down next to him. He too was silent. He ate. Min-Jae sat down on the other side. Silent. He ate. They knew what day it was. They knew what the number 60 meant. They didn't speak. They just sat side by side. After breakfast, Dae-Hyun went to the quarry. He worked. He struck the stone. He counted the blows, just like on the first day. Only now his hands were covered in calluses so thick that he couldn't feel the handle. He wielded the pickaxe as if it were an extension of his arm. His body had adapted. His mind had adapted. Everything had adapted except for one thing: the pain of knowing his father was dying and he wasn't there. That pain hadn't adapted. It simply was, like a stone in his pocket, warm and constant. At 2 o'clock, Yuna arrived, with a medical bag. She walked up to him. She said quietly that the letter had been sent, all 12 pages. Emily Zhang had confirmed receipt. Dae-Hyun nodded. Yuna stood beside him, silently. Then she said even more quietly that she was sorry. About his father. That she knew what it was like, to lose a father and not be there. Dae-Hyun looked at her. She looked at him. Her eyes were dark, deep, not impenetrable. For the first time in 2 months, there was something visible in them. Pain. Her own. Pain she had carried for 4 years, and which, at that moment, resonated with his pain like a tuning fork. He said nothing. She said nothing. They stood in the quarry under a gray sky and were silent. 10 seconds. Then she walked away to the next patient, and he picked up his pickaxe and continued chipping away at the stone. That evening in the dining hall, he stood up. Not to a bench. He simply stood up. The 65th day, 5 days after his father's death. Dae-Hyun was no longer counting the days until the deadline. There was no longer a deadline. Formally, the inheritance had gone to his uncle. On paper, Dae-Hyun had lost. But the paperwork was only the first layer. Emily Zhang was working. On the 68th day, a long letter arrived via Yoon. Emily had found Jae-Hoon in Taiwan. The accountant had agreed to testify. He had copies of the documents, fake contracts, forged signatures, a chain of transactions that led straight to Cho Gyeong-Ho's personal accounts. Emily contacted a law firm in New York, the firm where Maggie O'Donnell was a partner, a red-haired Irish woman, a mother of 2, a legal genius who swore like a dock worker when her children weren't listening. Maggie had been hired by Dae-Hyun's father through an intermediary even before the landing. She was instructed to spring into action when the boy sent a signal. The letter via Yoon was the signal. Maggie sprang into action. On the 70th day, the law firm filed a lawsuit with the International Court of Arbitration in The Hague. Not over an inheritance, over human rights. The unlawful detention of a citizen of the Republic of Korea on territory not recognized by any state. At the same time, Emily published an article in the Korea Herald. Dae-Hyun didn't see the headline, but Yuna retold it to him. The article was about Blackstone Isle, about an island that doesn't exist, about the 2,500 people who had been erased, about the 12 families who control the judicial system and the people. The article went viral. Yuna said it had been read 4 million times in the first 24 hours. Korean TV channels picked it up, then international ones, CNN, BBC, NHK. The island that doesn't exist ended up on every screen in the world. On the 72nd day, the first foreign delegation arrived on the island. A boat carrying the Korean consul and 2 representatives from an international human rights organization. Security wouldn't let them through. Then they let them through, because following the consul's boat was a second boat, with journalists, with cameras. Not letting the consul through in front of the cameras would have meant confirming everything Emily Zhang had written. Dae-Hyun learned about the delegation from Tae-Seong. He left the block. He walked across the courtyard toward the administrative building, past the quarries, past the laundry room, past the cafeteria. Seung-Woo followed him. Behind Seung-Woo was Min-Jae. Behind Min-Jae were 10 more men, in silence, in gray robes, with numbers on their backs. 12 men walked across the courtyard of a prison that no longer existed, and the guards parted to let them through. Not because they were afraid, because they understood that it was all over. Cameras were rolling. The world was watching. Dae-Hyun entered the administration building. The consul was standing at the reception desk, a tall Korean man in a suit. Human rights activists stood nearby. The deputy warden stood nearby. His face was gray. His hands were in his pockets. Coordinator Lim stood behind him, missing the little finger on his left hand. Dae-Hyun approached the consul. He gave his name, Cho Dae-Hyun, a citizen of the Republic of Korea, inmate B447, illegally detained. The consul looked at him, at his prison uniform, at his scars, at his bandaged arm, at the 12 men behind him. He said he knew who he was, that Maggie O'Donnell had forwarded all the documents, that the release process had begun. Dae-Hyun nodded. Then he turned to the deputy chief. He looked at him, silently, for 3 seconds. The deputy looked away. Dae-Hyun said nothing. He didn't need to. The process took 20 days. Bureaucracy, documents, approvals. An international scandal was unfolding in parallel. Through old connections, which turned out not to be as dead as everyone thought, Seo Jong-Il mobilized human rights organizations in Asia and Europe. The old man had been silent for 22 years, but when he spoke, the world listened, because he knew the names, the dates, the schemes. He was the financial architect of the 12 families, and the architect had his blueprints. Emily published one article after another, every day a new article. Every article, another nail in the coffin. Maggie in New York was leading a legal offensive on 3 fronts: international arbitration, a Korean court, and the U.S. Court of Human Rights. Her uncle in Seoul realized what was happening. Too late. His lawyers tried to block the publications. It didn't work. They tried to discredit Emily. It didn't work. They tried to find Jae-Hoon in Taiwan. They didn't make it in time. The accountant had already testified under oath. On the 99th day, a release order arrived, signed by a Korean court. 2 teens' names: Dae-Hyun first, Seung-Woo, Min-Jae, Tae-Seong, Kwon, Badam. 6 more. And Seo Jong-Il. 12. That's how many people he called his own. Morning of the 91st day, 4 o'clock, rain, just like on the first day. The cold November wind had gone. The February wind had come. Just as cold, just as wet, just as salty. The concrete pier at Blackstone Isle. The same stains on the concrete that the rain couldn't wash away. The same floodlights, the same watchtowers. Only now, standing on the pier were not 4 newcomers in gray robes. Standing on the pier were 12 men. Dae-Hyun in the same gray robe with the number B447 on his back. Next to him, Seung-Woo, broad-shouldered, short-cropped hair, a scar across his eyebrow. His face was calm, hands in his pockets. Next to him was Min-Jae, an old hand, wiry, gray-haired. On the inside of his left wrist was a tattoo of Sori, the name of the daughter he hadn't seen in 12 years. Tae-Seong. His left hand has healed. The fingers have fused together neatly. Yuna knew what she was doing. Kwon, the old man from the laundromat. His left eye could see better. The eye drops helped, not completely, but better. Baram, a former chef from Busan. Quiet, calm. A man who had been putting soup in the nurse's locker for 2 months and never once asked why. Seo Jong-Il, 72 years old, small, withered. He gave the pebble to Dae-Hyun, but in his hands were drawings, a stack of them, the same house, the same mountains, the same river, 22 years of a single drawing. He carried it with him to the mainland. A boat was moored at the pier, not a prison transport, a civilian vessel. On board were Maggie's lawyers, 2 of them, with folders of documents and umbrellas. On the second boat were journalists, cameras, microphones. The spotlight cut through the rain. 12 men in gray robes on the concrete pier of a prison that doesn't exist. A scene that will be shown tomorrow on every channel in the world. Seon-Ho went first. He stepped onto the boat's gangway. He stopped. He looked at the island, at the walls, at the watchtowers. 8 years. 8 years for his brother, who died of an overdose and never knew that Seong-Woo had taken the blame. 8 years on a bunk in a 2x3 cell. He turned around and kept walking, without looking back. Min-Jae followed him, an old man who had hated the world for 11 years and waited for the world to die first. An old man who had his daughter's name tattooed on his wrist, and nothing else. He walked up the gangway, and for a second, he touched the railing with his hand, as if to check that it was real, that this wasn't a dream, that the boat wouldn't vanish. Tae-Seong, Kwon, Baram, the rest. One by one, 12 of them stepped onto the gangway and boarded the boat. Seo Jong-Il walked slowly. His legs wouldn't obey him well. 22 years without proper exercise. His muscles had atrophied. His joints creaked. But he walked on his own. He didn't hold on to the railing. He didn't accept help. On his own. On the boat's deck, he stopped. He looked up at the sky. Gray, wet, vast. For 22 years, he'd seen the sky through a window the size of his palm. Now the sky was everywhere, above him, all around him, endless. He stood and looked. Rain pelted his face. He didn't shield himself. Dae-Hyun walked last. That was how it should be. The captain is the last to leave the ship. He walked along the pier, past those same stains that the rain couldn't wash away. On the same concrete he'd walked on the first day, when he was still the heir, when he was still the vice president, when he was still somebody. Now he was nobody. Prisoner B447 in a gray prison jumpsuit, with no name in the family registry, with no inheritance, with no office, with no suit, with a pebble in his pocket, scars on his body, and 12 people on the boat waiting for him. He stopped at the gangway. He turned around. A figure stood on the concrete pier. Choi Yuna, in a white lab coat, holding a patient file. Her contract still had a year left. She stood in the rain, looking at him. Her face was wet. Not from the rain, or maybe from the rain. He couldn't tell. It didn't matter. Dae-Hyun took the tag off his neck, a wooden one, with the number B447, which he'd carved himself from a piece of nar wood because he refused to believe that was his number. He turned the number into a talisman, a reminder, a promise. He tossed the tag across 10 meters of wet concrete. Yuna caught it, with one hand, precisely, the way you catch things you've been waiting for. She looked at the tag, at the letters and numbers carved into the wood with a knife. B447. She looked up, she looked at him, and she smiled. For the first time in 4 years. Not a professional smile, not a polite one, a real one. Small, fleeting, like light filtering through a crack in closed shutters. Dae-Hyun said through the rain, without raising his voice. He said he'd come for her in person in a year. Not for the doctor, for her. Yuna didn't answer. She stood on the pier, clenched the tag in her fist, and for the first time in 4 years, she felt she had a tomorrow. Dae-Hyun turned away, stepped onto the gangway, boarded the boat. The boat pulled away. The island grew smaller. Walls, watchtowers, searchlights, the concrete pier. A white figure on the pier, getting smaller and smaller, getting farther and farther away, until it became a gray dot on the horizon. Then the dot vanished. Only the rain and the sea remained. It was quiet on deck. 12 men stood looking out at the water. No one spoke. There was no need to. 6 hours later, the boat docked at Incheon Harbor. People were waiting on shore. Journalists, human rights activists, Maggie O'Donnell in a dark blue coat, carrying a folder of documents 3 fingers thick. Her red hair was wet from the rain. She saw Dae-Hyun and smiled, broadly. That's the kind of smile you get when you win a case that was considered impossible. Standing next to Maggie was a woman, short, wearing a men's shirt over a dress, a watch on her left wrist, a large one, a men's watch. Emily Zhang, the journalist who had taken down 2 chaebols and was now taking down a third. She wasn't smiling. She was looking at Dae-Hyun intently, appraisingly. The way you look at someone you've been writing about for 3 months but are seeing for the first time. Dae-Hyun stepped ashore, his first step on land that wasn't an island. A strange sensation. The ground beneath his feet felt soft, unreal, as if he'd forgotten how to walk on normal land. Maggie approached. She held out her hand. He shook it. She said she was glad to see him, that he looked like crap, and that he needed a soul doctor and a suit, in that order. Dae-Hyun almost smiled. Almost. Behind him, Min-Jae stepped ashore. He stopped. He stood on the Incheon Pier and looked out at the city. The lights, the cars, the people. A world he hadn't seen in 11 years. And through the crowd of journalists and human rights activists, a young woman was walking. Not very tall, 24 years old, black hair, a quiet face, eyes that held so much that words couldn't capture it all. Han So-ri, the daughter Min-Jae hadn't seen in 12 years. The daughter who had grown up as an orphan while her father was still alive, who had carried the shame of her last name like a millstone around her neck, whom Emily had found while conducting an interview, who had come to Incheon because she couldn't help but come. So-ri stopped 3 meters away from Min-Jae. He looked at her. She looked at him. 11 years. 12. She had been a child when he left. Now she was a grown woman. Min-Jae didn't move. His arms hung at his sides. His face was stony, as always, just as it had been for the past 11 years. So-ri took a step, then another, then a third. She approached him. She stood in front of him and said one word. Appa. Dad. Min-Jae clenched his jaw. A muscle in his cheek twitched. Once. He raised his hand. Slowly. He placed it on his daughter's head. Just as he had when she was 12. So-ri closed her eyes, and pressed herself against him. Min-Jae embraced her, with both arms, tightly. His hands were trembling, for the first time in 11 years. Dae-Hyun watched them. Then he turned away. This wasn't meant for strangers to see. He looked at Seung-Woo. Seung-Woo was standing nearby, wearing a cheap jacket they'd given him on the boat over his work clothes. He was looking at the harbor, at the city, at the world. Dae-Hyun said he had a job for Seung-Woo, if he wanted it. Seung-Woo looked at him, asked what kind. Dae-Hyun said that in 6 months, he'd be fighting for Kyongsung Group, that he needed someone to stand by the door during meetings and keep quiet. Seung-Woo smiled, for the first time in 8 years. Months passed. Dae-Hyun had his name restored in the family registry. The Hojuk Talte procedure had been overturned by the court. He was Cho Dae-Hyun again, not B447. Maggie was handling the case, not in court, on the market, because his father had left a surprise. 40% of Kyongsung Group had been transferred, not to his uncle and not to Dae-Hyun, to a trust. The beneficiary of the trust would be the person who survived on Blackstone Isle and brought others back from there. Legally, it was flawless. Her father had been preparing this document for years. Maggie discovered the trust 3 weeks after her release. When she showed Dae-Hyun the terms, he was silent for 10 minutes. Then he asked if she had known all along. Maggie said she hadn't known, that her father had given her instructions in parts. Each part was unlocked after the previous one was completed, like a quest. The old man was still running the game even after his death. Dae-Hyun received 40%. His uncle controlled 30%. The remaining 30% were on the market. The war for Kyongsung Group had begun. Not in the courtroom, on the market. Dae-Hyun applied the logic of the island to corporate warfare. Every shareholder is a prisoner with resources and fears. Every board of directors is a dining hall with territories. Every deal is a cigarette exchange. Only now, the cigarettes were worth millions. 5 months after his release, Maggie handed him an envelope, sealed, old, with a notary's seal, a letter from his father, one that had been lying on the old man's desk, one that was to be opened only if his son survived. Dae-Hyun opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, his father's handwriting, small, neat. He read it. His father wrote that he knew about his uncle, that he knew about the setup, that he hadn't stopped it, that he'd asked his brother to carry out a controlled hit, because he was afraid that after his death, his son would find himself at the head of an empire that would devour him. A corporation is an island. An island is a corporation. If his son didn't survive hell, then hell in a $12,000 suit would destroy him even faster. My uncle agreed. But he betrayed me. He realized he could take it all, and he did. My father knew it was possible, and he took the risk anyway, because he believed in his son. He believed the boy would return. The last line. I didn't leave the corporation to my son. I left it to whoever you become. Dae-Hyun sat by the window of his new office, a temporary one, a small one, not on the 42nd floor, on the 3rd, in a rented office. Sonu stood by the door, silently. Dae-Hyun folded the letter. He put it in his pocket, where a small pebble was already lying. Seung-Woo silently poured him some tea. A year later, his uncle fell. Not from a single blow, but from a series of them. Shareholders sided with Dae-Hyun one by one, not because he was stronger, but because he was more honest. He kept every promise. He closed every deal. He remembered every person by name. The logic of the island worked in Seoul just as it did on Blackstone Isle. Trust is shareholder equity. Reputation is currency. A word is a contract. His uncle resigned as chairman on a quiet Tuesday. No press conference, no statements. He simply left. Dae-Hyun didn't celebrate. He conducted his first board meeting with the same tone he'd used back then, sitting across from Seung-Woo at the table in the Blackstone Isle dining hall. A steady voice, almost monotonous. Facts, figures, forecasts. The board listened. Seung-Woo stood by the door in a cheap jacket and said nothing. Everyone knew who he was. Everyone knew where he was from. No one spoke to him disrespectfully. Because Dae-Hyun had said it at the very first meeting. This is Park Seung-Woo. He saved my life 14 times. If anyone speaks to him disrespectfully, you'll have me to deal with. Seung-Woo didn't cry, but for the first time in 10 years, he was breathing evenly. 2 years later, Dae-Hyun began restructuring the Kyoung-sung Group. At the same time, he pressured the government to investigate Blackstone Isle, not as a former prisoner, but as the chairman of a conglomerate with an annual turnover of $40 billion. 3 years later, the international investigation concluded. Blackstone Isle was shut down. All 2,500 inmates were evacuated. The cases were reviewed. Yuna was the last to leave the island. As a doctor, she stayed until the very last patient was treated. Her contract ended on the day of the closure. She walked out onto the pier with her medical bag slung over her shoulder. Standing on the pier was a man in a $12,000 suit, with a pebble in one pocket and a plastic spoon in the other. The spoon from Blackstone Isle that he hadn't thrown away. Yuna stopped. She looked at him, at his suit, at his watch, at his face, which had changed. It had grown harder, older. But the eyes were the same, the ones she'd first seen when she bandaged his arm at the quarry. Dae-Hyun said he'd promised to come in person. Yuna looked at the wooden tag hanging around her neck. B447. She'd been wearing it for 2 years, every day. She never took it off. She said she knew, that she'd been waiting. After Jo-Il was released, he finally told her. He told her about Dae-Hyun's mother, about the shipyard, about how 2 young men built a shed in Ulsan and dreamed of ships, about the woman with kind eyes who brought them lunch and laughed so hard that even the seagulls fell silent, about the betrayal, about the choice Kyung-Suk made, about 30 years in a cell where his only connection to the past was a pebble from the beach in Busan. Dae-Hyun listened. He sat across from the old man in a small apartment in Gangnam that he had bought for him. Tea on the table. Outside the window was Seoul. Lights. Life. The old man spoke quietly, without anger, without bitterness. He simply told his story, as if it were a story that had happened to someone else long ago. When he finished, Dae-Hyun asked if the old man had forgiven his father. Seo Jong-Il looked at him into eyes that were his mother's eyes and said he had forgiven him on the day Dae-Hyun entered cell 17. Because the son had atoned for his father's debt. Not with words, by his presence, by the fact that he came, by the fact that he saw, by the fact that he didn't walk by. Every week, Dae-Hyun stopped by to have tea with the old man. Ha-Hun, Seo Jong-il's granddaughter, came by in the evenings. She played the kayagum. The soft sounds of the strings filled the small apartment. The old man sat and listened. And he no longer needed the pictures of home on the wall, because home was right there. Dae-Hyun stood on the roof of the Kyoung-sung Group headquarters, the 42nd floor, a view of Seoul. The city lights stretched to the horizon, the wind from the Han River, warm, summery. A glass of tea in his hand, not coffee, tea, a habit from the island. The $12,000 suit fit him like a second skin, but in his left pocket lay a plastic spoon from Blackstone Isle. He hadn't thrown it away, he never would. In his right pocket was a pebble from the beach in Busan. smooth, warm. 30 years ago, his mother had picked it up from the sand and given it to an old man who built ships. The old man had kept it for 22 years in a 3x3 cell, and he'd passed it on to the son of the woman he loved like a sister. Down below, the city was alive. Cars, people, lights, a world that didn't know and wasn't meant to know that the chairman of Korea's largest conglomerate was standing on the roof holding a plastic spoon in his pocket. He finished his tea. He set the glass on the parapet. He looked up at the sky. Gray. Just like on the island, but different. This guy was over a free land, over a city where his people lived normal lives. Seon-Woo stood by the door at every meeting and said nothing. Min-Jae lived with his daughter in an apartment on the south bank of the Han River. Tae-Seong worked as a courier for the Kyungsan Group Logistics Company. Kwon finally had eye surgery and could see out of both eyes. Bahram opened a small restaurant in Itaewon with the money Dae-Hyun had given him, interest-free and with no repayment deadline. Kozlov returned to Russia, but sent New Year's postcards. Seo Jong-Il drank tea in his apartment and no longer painted a house on the wall. Yuna worked at a university hospital in Seoul, a normal hospital, where patients recovered, where you could buy soup in the cafeteria. A wooden tag hung around her neck. Wooden tag. B447. Dae-Hyun turned away from the railing. He walked toward the door leading to the roof. Tomorrow, there was a meeting with the board. A new strategy. New markets, new people. The corporation was changing. Slowly, painfully, but it was changing. He wasn't building an empire. He was building a home. For those he called his own. The door closed behind him. An empty tea glass remained on the railing. The wind from the Han River picked up the steam rising from the dregs at the bottom and carried it toward the sea. Toward the horizon beyond which there had once been an island. The island was gone, but the spoon remained.